The crack of the Winchester rifle split the desert silence like thunder. Through the heat haze, Jackson Ward watched the stranger stumble backward, clutching his shoulder before falling to his knees beside the exhausted horse he had been whipping mercilessly moments earlier. From his position atop the ridge, Jackson methodically ejected the spent cartridge and chambered another round. His weathered hands performed the action with practiced efficiency, a muscle memory developed through years of combat and survival. At 45, Jackson's dark hair was now streaked with gray, and deep lines etched his sun-bronzed face. He guided Senator his sturdy bay gelding down the rocky slope toward the wounded man. The Arizona Territory summer sun beat down mercilessly, turning the landscape into a shimmering cauldron of heat and dust. It was 1885, 20 years since the end of the Civil War, but some men carried the conflict within them long after the fighting had stopped. "Mister, you got no right," the stranger snarled through gritted teeth. "This is my horse, and I'll treat him how I damn well please." Jackson dismounted, keeping his rifle trained on the man. No horse deserves a beating like that, especially not in this heat with no water for miles. The wounded man's eyes darted frantically from Jackson to his holstered revolver, calculating his chances. "Don't," Jackson warned. "I hit your shoulder on purpose. The next one goes through your chest." The stranger's hand froze. "You've made a mistake. Do you know who I work for?" Jackson knelt beside the mistreated horse, gently running his hand down its lathered neck, while keeping his eyes on the wounded man. "I don't much care," he replied, noticing the brand on the horse's haunch, a stylized H inside a circle. "But I recognize this brand. This isn't your horse." "Harmon will hear about this," the man threatened, pressing a bandana against his bleeding shoulder. The name struck Jackson like a physical blow. For a moment, he was no longer in the Arizona desert, but back in Tennessee, surrounded by the screams of women and children as flames consumed a small farming village. Captain Robert Harmon, standing before him, issuing orders that no human being should ever obey. "Harmon," Jackson's voice remained steady. "Robert Harmon." The wounded man's expression shifted to smug satisfaction. "Colonel Robert Harmon now. Owns half this territory and will own the other half soon enough." "I shot a man abusing a horse," Jackson said, tying the rescued horse to his own. "You've got water in your canteen, and you're only a few miles from Clayton's Crossing. You'll make it if you start walking now." "What's your name?" the wounded man called after him. "Harmon will want to know who to look for." Jackson didn't answer, urging Senator forward without looking back. 20 years he'd spent trying to escape the shadow of Willow Creek, trying to outrun the ghost that haunted his dreams. And now, in this godforsaken corner of the Arizona Territory, the past had found him again. 3 days later, Jackson found himself standing before a weather-beaten sign that read, "Property for sale, 35. Inquire at Clayton's store." The ranch itself matched the sign, a single-story adobe house with a sagging porch, a barn listing slightly a corral with more gaps than rails, and a well that looked as dried up as the surrounding landscape. Clayton, the store owner and de facto mayor of the small settlement, seemed surprisingly eager to complete the sale. "Previous owner left in quite a hurry," he explained as he counted Jackson's money. "Didn't even take all his belongings." "Any particular reason?" Jackson asked, signing the crude bill of sale. Clayton hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on the counter. "Well, water's been scarce these past 2 seasons. Droughts hit everyone hard, and then there's the troubles. This have anything to do with a man named Harmon?" The change in Clayton's demeanor was immediate. His face paled, and his eyes darted to the windows as if checking who might be listening. "I'd be careful mentioning that name around these parts," he said quietly. "Colonel Harmon is an important man, bringing civilization and progress to the territory." "Is that what they're calling it these days?" Clayton pushed the papers across the counter hurriedly. "A word of advice in this country: water is more valuable than gold. Remember that." By sunset, Jackson had reached his new property. He unsaddled Senator, rubbing the gelding down before leading him to the corral. "Well, old friend," he said, "this is home now. Try not to look too disappointed." The house was sparse but intact. A table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a bed frame with a straw mattress comprised the entirety of the furnishings. Jackson placed his saddlebags on the table and extracted a bottle of whiskey, his constant companion since Willow Creek. The familiar burn traced a path down his throat, momentarily chasing away the chill that had nothing to do with the desert night and everything to do with memories that never faded. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. Jackson moved inside, retrieving his rifle before returning to stand in the shadows of the porch. "Hello, the house," a voice called. "Don't mean no harm." "State your business," Jackson replied, keeping his rifle ready but not raised. "Name's Mike Thornton. I've ranched the next property over about 3 miles east." The man's voice carried clearly in the night air. "Saw your light. Thought I'd pay a neighborly visit." Mike Thornton was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with a weathered face and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard labor. He dismounted, approaching with an open, friendly manner. "Clayton mentioned he'd sold this place," Thornton said. "Didn't expect anyone to move in so quick." "Price was right," Jackson replied, relaxing slightly but keeping his rifle at hand. Thornton nodded toward the well. "Check that yet?" "Not yet. Why, water's been scarce these past seasons. Most of the shallow wells in the area have gone dry." There was a tension in Thornton's voice that suggested more than just concern over drought conditions. "I noticed you didn't mention Harmon's outfit," Jackson observed. "Everyone else seems nervous just hearing the name." Thornton's expression hardened. "I've got no love for Harmon or his men. They've been buying up ranches all over the territory one way or another. Those who won't sell find their cattle mysteriously dying, their wells sabotaged, their buildings burned. Sounds like someone should stop them." A bitter laugh escaped Thornton's lips. "Easier said than done. Harmon's got the territorial governor in his pocket and enough hired guns to start a small war." He paused, studying Jackson more carefully. "You're not just some drifter looking for a quiet place to settle, are you?" "I was, until 3 days ago." "What happened 3 days ago?" "I crossed paths with one of Harmon's men. He was mistreating a horse." Thornton whistled low. "And you're still breathing. You must be handier with that rifle than most." "I've had practice," Jackson said simply. "Well, Mr. Ward, seems we might have common interests." Thornton extended his hand. "I've got 3 children to protect and a ranch that's been in my family for 2 generations. Could use a neighbor who's not afraid to stand his ground." Jackson hesitated only briefly before shaking the offered hand. "I'm not looking for trouble, Thornton. None of us are. But out here, trouble has a way of finding you regardless." Thornton mounted his horse. "Why don't you ride over tomorrow, meet the family? My eldest Thomas is about the age to appreciate meeting someone who knows his way around a rifle." That night, Jackson dreamed of Willow Creek, of screaming women and children, of Captain Robert Harmon shouting orders over the gunfire of his own voice, protesting commands that no human being should ever obey. He jolted awake, hand already on his revolver. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting silver shadows across the floor. He was certain he'd heard something. Rising silently, he moved to the window and peered out. The moonlit yard appeared empty, but fresh tracks in the dust told a different story. Someone had been watching him. The Thornton Ranch showed signs of once prosperous times: a 2-story main house, several outbuildings, a large barn, and extensive corrals. But the fields lay fallow, and the cattle in the distant pasture were too few for a ranch of this size. As Jackson approached, he noticed a young boy of about 10 watching him from the porch, a wooden toy rifle clutched in his hands. Behind him, a teenage girl hung laundry on a line, pausing to study the visitor. "You must be Mr. Ward," the girl called. "Pa said you might come by." She was perhaps 15, with a serious demeanor that seemed beyond her years. "That's right," Jackson replied, dismounting. "Your father around? He and Thomas are checking the north pasture. Should be back soon." She gestured toward the house. "I'm Rebecca. That's William, hiding behind the post, pretending he's not afraid of strangers." The boy emerged indignant. "I'm not afraid. I'm standing guard like Pa told me to." Inside, the Thornton home told the story of a family clinging to respectability despite hardship. The furnishings were well made but worn, and Jackson noticed Rebecca had patched her dress multiple times. Despite this, everything was meticulously clean, and the kitchen smelled of fresh baked bread. As Rebecca prepared coffee, William peppered Jackson with questions about his rifle, his horse, and whether he'd fought in the big war. Jackson answered patiently, recognizing in the boy's enthusiasm the same innocence his own son had possessed before fever had taken him while Jackson was away fighting. The thought brought a familiar ache to his chest. He touched the pocket watch in his vest, a habitual gesture of remembrance. Elizabeth's face, forever young, stared back at him from the small daguerreotype inside alongside their son James. Is that your family? William asked, noticing the watch. Jackson snapped it closed. Yes, they're gone now. Rebecca placed a steaming cup before him, her expression softening with understanding. The war. In a manner of speaking, Jackson replied. Fever took them while I was away. The sound of horses announced Mike Thornton's return. He entered the kitchen accompanied by a tall, lanky youth who could only be his eldest son, Thomas. At 17, the boy had his father's build, but moved with the restless energy of youth. Ward, glad you came, Thornton greeted him warmly. I see you've met Rebecca and William. This here's Thomas. The young man nodded curtly, his expression wary. Jackson recognized the look, the protective stance of a son who'd shouldered too much responsibility too young. As the boys departed to tend to Jackson's horse, Thornton's jovial demeanor faded. Rebecca, would you mind giving us a moment? The girl nodded, understanding, passing between father and daughter before she withdrew. We had visitors last night, Thornton said once they were alone. 3 riders asking about a new settler who'd crossed one of Harmon's men. Jackson's hand instinctively moved toward his revolver. Here looking for me? Not yet. They were checking all the nearby ranches, but they'll get here eventually. Thornton leaned forward, lowering his voice. They mentioned offering a reward for information about you. $50. That's a lot of money in these parts. Enough to tempt folks who are desperate, Thornton agreed. And Harmon's made sure plenty of folks around here are desperate. Jackson considered this information. I should move on. No sense bringing trouble to your door. Running won't solve anything. Harmon doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. Thornton's expression was grim. Besides, you bought that property fair and square. You've got as much right to be here as anyone. Rights don't mean much against bullets. Thornton. Mike, the rancher corrected. If we're going to be allies, might as well use first names. Jackson raised an eyebrow. I don't recall agreeing to any alliance. You crossed Harmon. That makes us natural allies, whether you like it or not. Mike leaned back in his chair. Look, I'm not asking you to fight my battles, but we can watch each other's backs, share information, maybe find a way to stand against Harmon that doesn't get us all killed. Before Jackson could respond, Thomas burst through the door, his face flushed with anger. The Northwell's been tampered with. Mike was on his feet instantly. What do you mean tampered? Someone's thrown something down it. There's a strange smell and the water's got an oily sheen. Thomas's eyes darted to Jackson suspiciously. Happened sometime last night or early this morning. That's our main water source, Mike explained to Jackson, his face pale. The house well dried up months ago. Jackson stood. Show me. The north well was a simple stone structure about a half-mile from the house. As Thomas had reported, an oily film covered the water's surface, and a pungent chemical smell rose from the depths. Kerosene, maybe, Jackson suggested, examining the ground around the well. And something else. Lye, possibly. Poisoned, Mike said grimly. They've poisoned our water. Thomas kicked the well's stone wall in frustration. This is Harmon's work. First he dams the creek that feeds our land, then he poisons what little water we have left. Jackson followed a set of tracks leading away from the well. 3 men on horseback. Same ones who came asking questions, most likely. What do we do, Pa? Thomas demanded. We can't last a week without this well. Mike ran a hand through his hair, desperation evident in his gesture. We'll have to try deepening the house well again. We've tried twice already, Thomas objected. Nothing but dry rock below 30 feet. Jackson continued studying the tracks. These men were headed southeast, toward my property. The realization hit all 3 men simultaneously. If Harmon's men had poisoned the Thornton well, they might have done the same to Jackson's. I need to get back, Jackson said, already moving toward his horse. We'll come with you, Mike offered. No. Jackson's tone left no room for argument. Stay here, protect your family. I can handle this. He rode hard, pushing Senator to a gallop despite the heat. As he approached his property, Jackson slowed, scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. The place appeared deserted, but experience had taught him that appearances could be deceiving. He approached cautiously, circling wide to approach from the rear. Dismounting at a distance, he secured Senator in a stand of mesquite and proceeded on foot, rifle ready. The well stood about 20 yards from the house. As he neared, Jackson spotted fresh footprints in the brush surrounding it. 3 men, just as he'd suspected. Moving with silent precision, Jackson approached the well. There was no smell of chemicals, but that didn't mean the water hadn't been tampered with. The sound of a hammer being cocked froze him in place. "Don't move, mister," a gruff voice ordered from behind. "Lest you want a hole in your back." Jackson remained still, calculating his options. One man behind him, possibly more nearby. His rifle was in his hands, but pointing at the ground. "You the new owner?" the voice demanded. "I am." "Harmon wants a word with you about one of his men you shot." "He can find me here any time," Jackson replied calmly. A harsh laugh. "Oh, he will. But first we got a little message for you." The crunch of boots on gravel alerted Jackson to a second man approaching from the side. This one carried a canvas bag from which he produced a bottle of dark liquid. "See, water's precious in these parts," the first man continued. "Shame if something happened as to yours." Jackson made his decision in an instant. Dropping to one knee, he swung his rifle around in a single fluid motion, firing from the hip. The shot caught the first man in the thigh, sending him sprawling backward, his own shot going wide. The second man dropped the bottle, reaching for his pistol, but Jackson was already moving. He charged forward, slamming the butt of his rifle into the man's stomach, then bringing it up hard against his jaw. The hired gun collapsed unconscious. A third shot rang out from the direction of the house. Jackson dove behind the well as splinters of stone erupted where his head had been a moment before. "You're dead, mister," a voice called from the house. "Nobody crosses Harmon and lives." Jackson peered carefully around the well. A third man was using the doorway of the house for cover, his revolver trained on the well. "Your friends need help," Jackson called back. "One's bleeding, bay. Other one might have a broken jaw." They knew the risks. "So do you," Jackson replied. "I've got a clear shot at your left side from here." "You want to test who's faster?" After a tense silence. "What do you want?" "Put your gun down. Come out with your hands up." After a moment's hesitation, a revolver skidded into the dust. The third man emerged slowly, hands raised. With the situation under control, Jackson bound the three men using strips torn from their own shirts. The first man's leg wound was bleeding freely, but not life-threatening. "Now," Jackson said, addressing the third man who appeared to be the leader, "you're going to tell me exactly what Harmon wants with my property." The man spat in the dust. "Go to hell." Jackson cocked his rifle, pressing the barrel against the man's kneecap. "Wrong answer." Fear flashed across the hired gun's face. "Right, ease off." He swallowed hard. "It ain't just your property. It's all the land around here. Harmon's buying everything between the mountains and the river. Waipo Railroad's coming through. Southern Pacific's laying track from Tucson to Fort Worth. They need water for the steam engines, for the workers, for the towns that'll spring up along the road." Jackson processed this information. "So Harmon buys the land cheap, then sells to the railroad at a profit." The man nodded. "Those who won't sell find themselves having difficulties." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the conversation. Jackson tensed, raising his rifle, but relaxed slightly when he recognized Mike Thornton, accompanied by Thomas and another rider, a heavy-set man wearing a badge. "Ward," Mike called as they approached. "You all right?" "Fine," Jackson replied, not taking his eyes off his prisoners. "Caught these three trying to poison my well." The badge-wearing rider dismounted, revealing himself to be a man in his 50s with gray-streaked hair and the watchful eyes of a lawman who'd seen too much. "Sheriff Daniel Morgan," he introduced himself. "Thornton here said there might be trouble." "Already handled," Jackson replied. Morgan surveyed the scene, one man bleeding, one unconscious, one tied to the porch post. "So I see." His tone was neutral, but Jackson detected a note of approval. "These Harmon's men, they are the leader," confirmed defiantly. "And you got no right holding us, Sheriff. We ain't done nothing illegal." "Attempted poisoning and assault look pretty illegal to me," Morgan observed dryly. "Ain't no law against visiting a neighbor," the man insisted. "This lunatic shot Hank for no reason, then attacked me and Pete." Morgan turned to Jackson. "That true? They were about to pour something in my well," Jackson replied. "When I confronted them, they drew on me. I defended myself." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "Well, now that presents quite a dilemma. It's your word against theirs." He gestured toward the drop bottle which had shattered on impact. "Though that spilled liquid does smell suspiciously like kerosene mixed with something else." "Here's what I'm going to do," Morgan continued. I'm going to take these men back to Clayton's Crossing. Hold them for 24 hours on suspicion of trespassing and attempted vandalism. He fixed the leader with a stern look. By then, I expect Colonel Harmon will have sent someone to retrieve them. You can tell him if he has a problem with Mr. Ward, he should address it legally, not by sending thugs to poison wells. As Morgan and Thomas loaded the prisoners onto their horses, Mike approached Jackson. You handled yourself well, mon he observed. Not many men could take on three-armed opponents and walk away without a scratch. Jackson shrugged. I've had practice. I meant what I said earlier. We need to stick together. Mike extended his hand again. Partners. Jackson hesitated. He'd come seeking isolation, not alliance. But Robert Harmon's presence changed everything. Perhaps this was the reckoning he'd been avoiding for 20 years. He clasped Mike's hand firmly. Partners. As they prepared to depart, Sheriff Morgan approached Jackson privately. Thornton tells me you had a run-in with one of Harmon's men a few days back, over a mistreated horse. That's right. Morgan studied him thoughtfully. Not many men would risk their lives for a horse. It was the right thing to do. Indeed. Morgan's weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts. Robert Harmon is not a man to be trifled with. He came to this territory after the war with nothing but his military reputation. Now he owns half the county and has the governor's ear. You sound like you admire him, Jackson observed. I recognize a dangerous man when I see one, Morgan corrected, just as I recognize a man with military training. His gaze sharpened. You served Union Navy sharpshooter. Morgan nodded as if confirming a suspicion. Thought so, the way you handle that rifle. He trailed off, then reached inside his vest to produce a card. If Harmon's men cause you any more trouble, send word. I can't promise much, my jurisdiction only extends so far, and Harmon has friends in high places, but I'll do what I can. Jackson accepted the card, studying the sheriff with new interest. There was something in the man's manner that suggested personal knowledge of Harmon, perhaps even a history. You know him, Jackson stated rather than asked. Harmon, from before. A shadow crossed Morgan's face. We've crossed paths. He mounted his horse. Be careful, Mr. Ward. Men like Harmon don't forget those who stand against them. That night, as Jackson sat on his porch watching the stars, he found himself at a crossroads. He could still pack up and leave, find another remote corner of the frontier to hide away in. But something held him here now, a chance to finally face the ghosts of Willow Creek. He was lost in these thoughts when the distant glow on the horizon caught his attention. Fire miles away, but substantial enough to light up the night sky. In the direction of the Thornton Ranch. Jackson was on his feet, instantly reaching for his rifle. As he saddled Senator, the crack of distant gunfire confirmed his worst fears. The Thornton family was under attack. He rode hard through the darkness, pushing his horse to its limits. But even as he crested the final rise overlooking the Thornton property, Jackson knew he was too late. The main house was engulfed in flames, the fire casting a hellish glow over the scene. Several riders circled the burning building, firing into the windows. In the yard, Mike Thornton lay motionless, his shirt dark with blood. Thomas was on one knee beside him, firing desperately at the attackers with a shotgun. Rebecca stood in the doorway of the barn, clutching William to her chest, her face a mask of terror. As Jackson watched in horror, two riders broke away from the main group, heading directly for the barn. Thomas saw the danger too and tried to redirect his fire, but his shotgun clicked empty. Jackson steadied his breathing, raised his Winchester, and fired. The lead rider jerked in the saddle, then tumbled to the ground. The second reined in sharply, looking around for the source of the shot. The remaining attackers, alerted to the new threat, began to scatter, firing wildly in Jackson's direction. He slid from Senator's back, using the ridge for cover, as he continued to pick off targets with methodical precision. Within moments, the surviving attackers were in full retreat, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Jackson raced down the slope toward the Thornton family, but even as he approached it, he could see Thomas being overpowered by two men who had circled behind him during the confusion. "Thomas!" Rebecca screamed as her brother was dragged toward a waiting horse. One of the attackers grabbed William, tearing him from his sister's grasp, despite her desperate attempts to hold on. The boy's terrified wails cut through the night as he was thrown across a saddle. Jackson fired at the retreating kidnappers, but they were already beyond effective range, using the smoke from the burning house as cover. By the time he reached the yard, they were gone, taking Thomas and William with them. Rebecca stood frozen in shock, her arms still outstretched, toward where her brothers had been moments before. "Rebecca," Jackson said gently, approaching her, "are you hurt?" She turned to him, her eyes widened and unfocused. "They took them," she whispered. "They took Thomas and William." Dawn found Jackson kneeling beside Mike Thornton's bloodied form. The rancher had survived the night, but barely. His breathing came in shallow gasps, his face gray with blood loss. Rebecca had not left her father's side, her hands steady as she cleaned and bandaged his wounds despite her own exhaustion and fear. "The doctor in Clayton's Crossing might be able to help him," Jackson said gently. Rebecca shook her head. "He won't survive the journey, not in his condition." Her voice was hollow, drained of emotion. "Besides, we need to find Thomas and William." Jackson studied the tracks left by the kidnappers. At least 6 riders had headed northwest toward the mountains that marked the unofficial boundary of Apache territory. Following them would be dangerous, not just because of Harmon's men, but because few white men returned from those mountains. "I'll go after your brothers," Jackson said, checking his ammunition. "You stay with your father." "No," Rebecca's tone left no room for argument. "Thomas and William are my responsibility now. I'm coming with you." "Rebecca, this isn't a discussion, Mr. Ward." She stood wiping her hands on her blood-stained apron. "Mrs. Jenkins from the next valley can tend to Pa. I'll ride to fetch her before we leave." Jackson recognized the steel in her voice, the same determination he'd seen in Elizabeth when their son had fallen ill. He nodded once, respecting her decision. By mid-morning, they were following the kidnappers' trail. Rebecca rode a sturdy pinto mare, a Winchester rifle across her lap. She had changed into men's clothing, her brother's Jackson guessed practical for hard riding. Her face was set in grim lines, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "You know how to use that?" Jackson asked, nodding toward the rifle. "Pa taught all of us to shoot," she replied. "Said a woman on the frontier needs to protect herself." The trail led them deeper into rugged country, a landscape of twisted rock formations and deep arroyos. By afternoon, they had reached the foothills of the mountains, where the tracks veered north along a dry creek bed. "They're heading for Devil's Pass." Rebecca observed, her expression tightening. "What's significant about that?" "It's the only way through these mountains for miles, but it crosses into Apache territory." She glanced at Jackson. "Most folks around here won't go near it." "Most folks aren't tracking kidnappers," Jackson replied. As they approached the pass, a narrow gap between towering cliffs, Jackson felt the weight of unseen eyes watching them. He slowed Senator, scanning the rocks above. "We're being watched," he murmured to Rebecca. She nodded almost imperceptibly. "Apache." Before Jackson could respond, a figure materialized on the trail ahead. A tall man stood beside a massive black horse, his weathered face impassive. Though dressed in a mixture of white and native clothing, his Apache heritage was unmistakable in his high cheekbones and obsidian eyes. A Winchester rifle identical to Jackson's rested casually in his hands. "You're trespassing," the man stated flatly, his English perfect and unaccented. Jackson reined in, Senator, keeping his hands visible. "We're tracking men who kidnapped this woman's brothers." The stranger's gaze shifted to Rebecca, assessing her with penetrating intensity. Thornton's daughter, Rebecca, straightened in her saddle. "Yes. Do you know my family?" "I know of your father." The man's expression revealed nothing. "And I know the men you're tracking work for Robert Harmon." Jackson felt a ripple of surprise. "You know Harmon?" A bitter smile crossed the stranger's face. "All Apache know Harmon, the white devil who brings death." He studied Jackson more carefully. "But you're not one of his men." "No," Jackson confirmed. "My name is Jackson Ward. I'm helping the Thorntons." "John Two Rivers." The man introduced himself with a slight nod. "And you're both fools if you think you can go against Harmon with just the two of you." "We don't have a choice," Rebecca insisted. "He has my brothers. One of them is only 10 years old." Two Rivers' expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The boy is not harmed. Not yet." Hope flashed across Rebecca's face. "You've seen them." "I've been tracking Harmon's men since they crossed into our territory." Two Rivers gestured toward the pass. "They're at Harmon's compound about 15 miles north of here." "Will you help us?" Jackson asked directly. Two Rivers' face hardened again. "Why should I help white people? Your kind has brought nothing but suffering to mine." "Because there's an innocent child involved," Jackson replied. And because it sounds like you have your own reasons to want to hurt Harmon. For a long moment, Two Rivers was silent, his dark eyes unreadable. Finally, he nodded once. I will take you to where you can see Harmon's compound. What you do after that is your concern. As they made camp that evening in a secluded box canyon, Two Rivers revealed more about himself. He had served as a scout for the U.S. Army during the Apache Wars, guiding his soldiers through territory they could never have navigated alone. But when Harmon, then a colonel, had ordered the massacre of an Apache village, women and children included, Two Rivers had deserted, unable to be part of such butchery. I belong nowhere now, he explained, tending the small, smokeless fire he had built. Not with my people, who see me as a traitor. Not with whites, who see only my skin. How did Harmon end up here? Jackson asked. Last I knew, he was facing court-martial for what happened at Willow Creek. Two Rivers' head snapped up, his eyes suddenly intent. You know of Willow Creek? Jackson hesitated, then nodded. I was there, serving under Harmon. Rebecca looked between the two men, confusion evident on her face. What happened at Willow Creek? A massacre, Two Rivers answered before Jackson could. A farming village in Tennessee suspected of harboring Confederate guerrillas. Harmon ordered it burned to the ground. No survivors. There were survivors, Jackson corrected quietly. I managed to hide a few families in a root cellar. Women and children. Two Rivers studied him with new interest. You defied Harmon's orders. Too late, Jackson admitted, the familiar weight of guilt settling on his shoulders. I should have acted sooner, stopped it before it began. Yet you tried, Two Rivers observed. Few white men would have done even that much. The next morning they left their horses concealed in the canyon and proceeded on foot. Two Rivers led them along game trails and ancient Apache paths that no white man had likely ever seen. By midday they had reached a ridge overlooking a valley where Harmon had established his compound. Jackson studied it through his field glass, impressed despite himself. What had once been a modest ranch had been transformed into a virtual fortress. A high stockade fence surrounded the main buildings with guard towers at each corner. Men with rifles patrolled the perimeter, and horses were corralled inside the walls. More like a military outpost than a ranch, Jackson muttered. Harmon thinks like a soldier, Two Rivers replied, always preparing for war. Jackson scanned the compound methodically, counting men and noting positions. At least 20 armed men that I can see. Mixed bunch, some look like cowboys, others more like professional gunmen. And some are Apache, Two Rivers added grimly. Jackson lowered the glass to look at him in surprise. Apache working for Harmon after what he did? Not all Apache are honorable. Two Rivers shrugged. Some will work for anyone who pays well. Others have no choice, their families held hostage to ensure their cooperation. Rebecca took the field glass, her hands trembling slightly. Do you see them, Thomas? Or William? Jackson directed her gaze toward the main house, a substantial two-story structure at the center of the compound. There on the porch. She gasped. That's William. He's playing with some kind of toy. Her voice rose in confusion. He doesn't look hurt or frightened. Jackson took back the glass, focusing on the scene. Indeed, the young boy sat on the porch steps, seemingly engrossed in examining what appeared to be a carved wooden horse. A man sat nearby, not a guard but a companion, speaking with the boy casually. I don't understand, Rebecca whispered. Why would they treat him well? Bait, Two Rivers suggested. Harmon knows someone will come for the boy. Jackson continued scanning the compound. I don't see Thomas anywhere. The older brother is kept separately, Two Rivers explained. In the barn, most likely. Harmon doesn't trust him. How do you know so much about what's happening inside? Jackson asked, suspicious now. Two Rivers met his gaze steadily. I have eyes and ears in many places, Ward. Not all who serve Harmon do so willingly. As Jackson turned the glass back to the main house, a figure emerged onto the porch that made his blood run cold. Robert Harmon stood tall and commanding, his military bearing unmistakable despite civilian clothes. His hair had grayed considerably since Willow Creek, but his face remained the same, handsome in a harsh way, with cold eyes that had watched a village burn without remorse. William looked up as Harmon approached, showing no fear as the man sat beside him on the steps. They appeared to be having a friendly conversation, Harmon pointing toward the mountains visible in the distance. What game is he playing? Rebecca whispered, confusion and anger warring in her voice. Harmon can be charming when it suits him, Jackson replied grimly. especially with those he wishes to manipulate. As he watched, Harmon produced a folded paper from his vest pocket, showing it to William. The boy studied it with interest, then pointed toward the northeast. Two Rivers hissed softly. The map. He's showing the boy the map. What map? Rebecca asked. A partial map to the underground water sources that run beneath these mountains, Two Rivers explained. Harmon has been searching for it for years. Your ranch and wards sit atop key points in the network. Jackson lowered the field glass, pieces falling into place. That's why he wants our land, not just for the railroad, but for the water itself. Two Rivers nodded. Water is more precious than gold in this territory. Whoever controls it controls everything. But the complete map has been divided and hidden for generations. My people guard one part. The original settler of your land held another. And you think William knows something about this map? Rebecca asked incredulously. Perhaps not consciously, Two Rivers replied, but children notice things adults overlook. The old settler who sold Ward his property may have hidden clues. If the boy has explored that area, a sudden commotion in the compound drew their attention. A group of riders was approaching the main gate, a dozen men led by a familiar figure. Sheriff Morgan, Jackson muttered, raising the field glass again. What's he doing here? They watched as Morgan was admitted to the compound, greeted by Harmon himself with apparent cordiality. The two men spoke briefly before entering the main house together, William following behind them. This complicates things, Two Rivers observed. Is Morgan working with Harmon? Rebecca asked, her voice tense with betrayal. Jackson hesitated. I'm not sure. He seemed genuinely concerned about Harmon's activities when we met. Many men wear two faces in this territory, Two Rivers said softly. One for the law, one for power. As darkness fell, they retreated to a more secure position to plan their next move. Two Rivers sketched a rough layout of the compound in the dirt, identifying potential weaknesses in its defenses. The guard rotation changes at midnight, he explained. There's a gap in coverage near the south wall where the kitchen gardens are located. We could enter there. 3 of us against 20 armed men, Rebecca shook her head. It's suicide. Not if we create a diversion, Jackson suggested. Draw most of the men away from the compound. Two Rivers considered this. There's a small herd of cattle in the north pasture. If they were suddenly spooked in the night, the guards would have to respond, Jackson nodded. Cattle are valuable, and a stampede could damage the fence line. They finalized their plan as the moon rose. Two Rivers would trigger the stampede while Jackson and Rebecca used the diversion to enter the compound and locate Thomas and William. They would meet at a designated point 2 miles east if separated. As Two Rivers prepared to leave, he paused, fixing Jackson with an intense stare. There's something you should know about Harmon's second in command, a man named Mills. What about him? He served with Harmon during the war and with you. Two Rivers' expression was grim. He speaks of Willow Creek often when drunk, takes pride in it. Jackson felt a chill run through him. Victor Mills, a young lieutenant who had followed Harmon's orders without question, shooting civilians with mechanical efficiency. Jackson had once pulled him off a young woman he was attempting to assault, earning Mills' undying hatred. Mills is here, he asked, his voice tight. Two Rivers nodded. Harmon's right hand. He oversees the rougher aspects of Harmon's business. This new information cast a darker shadow over their already dangerous mission. If Mills recognized Jackson, their slim chance of success would become virtually non-existent. 2 hours later, Jackson and Rebecca crouched in the shadows near the south wall of the compound, waiting for Two Rivers' diversion. The night was cool and clear, the stars providing just enough light to see by without revealing their position. Rebecca checked her rifle for the 3rd time, her movements betraying her nervousness despite her determined expression. If anything happens to me, she whispered, promise you'll still get my brothers out. Nothing's going to happen to you, Jackson assured her, though they both knew it was an empty promise. My father always said we should be prepared for the worst while hoping for the best, she replied with a sad smile. Before Jackson could respond, the distant sound of cattle bawling broke the night's silence. Moments later, shouts of alarm rose from within the compound as guards responded to the commotion. That's our cue, Jackson murmured, leading Rebecca toward the gap in the patrols Two Rivers had identified. They slipped over the wall undetected, using shadows and outbuildings for cover as they made their way toward the barn where Thomas was supposedly being held. The diversion had worked. Most of the guards had rushed to the north side of the compound to deal with the stampeding cattle. The barn door was padlocked, but Jackson made short work of it with a heavy rock. Inside, the building was dark and filled with the musty smell of hay and horses. They moved cautiously, aware that guards might still be posted within. "Thomas," Rebecca called softly. "Thomas, are you here?" A muffled sound came from a stall at the far end. They hurried toward it, finding Thomas bound and gagged, his face bruised, but his eyes alert and relieved at the sight of his sister. Jackson quickly cut the ropes binding the young man's wrists and ankles. "Can you walk?" Thomas nodded, removing the gag himself. "They worked me over pretty good, but nothing's broken." His voice was hoarse but steady. "William, is he safe?" "He's in the main house," Rebecca explained quickly. "He seems unharmed." "It's a trap," Thomas warned, gripping Jackson's arm. "They've been treating William well, asking him questions about our ranch, about the old map Pa kept in his study. They're using him to get information." "What kind of information?" Jackson asked. "Something about water sources, underground springs." Thomas shook his head in confusion. "They think Pa had a map showing their locations." Jackson and Rebecca exchanged glances. Two Rivers' theory had been correct. "We need to move," Jackson urged. "The diversion won't last much longer." They had just reached the barn door when a familiar voice froze them in place. "I figure it someone's would come for the barn," Sheriff Morgan said, stepping from the shadows, his revolver trained on them. "Though I didn't expect it to be you, Ward." Jackson raised his hand slowly, keeping his body between Morgan's gun and Rebecca. "Didn't expect to find you here either, Sheriff. Working for Harmon now." Morgan's weathered face betrayed no emotion. "It's more complicated than that." "Seems pretty simple to me," Thomas spat. "You're helping the man who burned our home and shot our father." "Your father's alive?" Morgan asked, genuine surprise crossing his features. "Barely, Papa," Rebecca replied coldly. "No thanks to your friend, Harmon." Morgan seemed to wrestle with some internal conflict. Finally, he lowered his revolver slightly. "I'm not Harmon's friend. Far from it." "Then what are you doing here?" Jackson demanded. "The same thing you are," Morgan replied cryptically, "looking for evidence." Before he could elaborate, the barn door burst open. Victor Mills stood framed in the doorway, flanked by two armed men. His lean face split into a predatory smile when he saw Jackson. "Well, well," he drawled. "Sergeant Jackson Ward. The colonel said you might show up eventually." His cold eyes flicked to Morgan. "Nicely done, Sheriff. Though you were supposed to alert us immediately, not have a friendly chat." Morgan's expression hardened. "They just arrived, Mills. I was about to bring them in." Mills studied Morgan suspiciously before turning his attention back to Jackson. "The great moral conscience of Willow Creek," he sneered. "Still playing the hero after all these years." Jackson met his gaze steadily. "Still hiding behind other men's guns, Mills." The taunt hit its mark. Mills' face flushed with anger, his hand tightening on his revolver. "I should kill you right here." "The colonel wants them alive," Morgan reminded him sharply. "All of them." Mills hesitated, then gestured to his men. "Search them, then bring them to the house." As one of the men approached, Jackson tensed, calculating odds. 3 armed men, plus Morgan, whose loyalties remained unclear. Thomas was injured, Rebecca unarmed. The chances of overpowering them all were slim at best. The distant sound of gunfire interrupted the standoff. Multiple shots in rapid succession, followed by shouts of alarm from across the compound. "The Apache," one of Mills' men muttered fearfully. Mills barked an order. "Davis, check it out." "Johnson, keep your gun on them." As Davis hurried from the barn, Jackson caught Thomas's eye, giving an almost imperceptible nod. The young man tensed, understanding the signal. The moment Davis was gone, Jackson made his move. Dropping to one knee, he swept his leg out, catching Johnson by surprise and sending him crashing to the floor. Thomas lunged for the fallen man's gun, while Rebecca ducked behind a stall for cover. Mills fired his shot, going wide as Morgan unexpectedly knocked his arm aside. "What the hell, Morgan?" Mills snarled, turning his fury on the sheriff. The distraction gave Jackson the opening he needed. He tackled Mills, driving him backward against the barn wall. The two men grappled fiercely, old hatred fueling their strength. Meanwhile, Thomas had secured Johnson's revolver and now held the dazed guard at gunpoint. Morgan stood with his weapon raised but seemed uncertain where to aim it. "Rebecca, go!" Jackson shouted as he struggled with Mills. "Find William." She hesitated only briefly before darting toward the door, Morgan making no move to stop her. Mills fought like a cornered wolf, his every move designed to maim or kill. He drove his knee into Jackson's side, then slammed his head forward in a vicious headbutt that left Jackson momentarily stunned. Breaking free, Mills drew a knife from his boot. "I've waited 20 years for this, Ward," he growled, circling warily. Jackson wiped blood from his split lip. 20 years nursing a grudge because I stopped you from raping a teenage girl, pathetic Mills. Even for you." With a roar of rage, Mills charged. Jackson sidestepped, using his opponent's momentum to slam him into a support post. The knife clattered to the floor. Thomas had his hands full with Johnson, who had recovered enough to fight back. The two young men wrestled for control of the revolver, their struggle moving dangerously close to where Jackson and Mills fought. Morgan finally took action, stepping forward to separate Thomas and Johnson with surprising strength for a man his age. "Enough," he barked, his gun now trained firmly on Johnson. "Son, help Ward. I've got this one." Thomas didn't question the unexpected assistance, immediately turning to aid Jackson. Together they overpowered Mills Thomas, striking him with the butt of his recovered revolver. Mills slumped to the floor unconscious. "Why are you helping us?" Jackson demanded of Morgan as they bound Mills and Johnson with stable ropes. "Because Harmon needs to be stopped," Morgan replied grimly. "And because I've been carrying the weight of Willow Creek for too long." From his vest pocket, Morgan produced a small leather-bound book. "My journal from the war. I was the regimental surgeon at Willow Creek. I documented everything Harmon's orders, the massacre, your attempt to stop it." He offered the journal to Jackson. "This is evidence that could finally bring Harmon to justice." Jackson stared at the journal, momentarily speechless. Here, after 20 years, was vindication proof that his memories of that terrible day were not distorted by guilt or time. "Why now?" he finally asked. "Why did you wait so long?" "Fear," Morgan admitted, shame evident in his voice. "And then opportunity. When I heard Harmon had established himself in this territory, I requested the sheriff's position specifically to gather more evidence against him." He gestured around them. "I've been playing a dangerous game, pretending to cooperate while documenting his crimes." The continuing sounds of gunfire outside reminded them of their precarious situation. "Rebecca's still out there," Thomas said urgently. "And William." "Go," Morgan urged. "I'll secure these two. There's a back exit through the tack room. Head east toward the mountains. Two Rivers knows safe paths through Apache territory." "You knew about Two Rivers?" Jackson asked, surprised. Morgan nodded. "We've had conversations. Now go before Harmon realizes what's happening." They slipped out through the tack room, as Morgan had suggested, emerging into chaos. The diversion Two Rivers had created had escalated into a full-scale attack. Several buildings were ablaze, and gunfire echoed across the compound as Harmon's men fought unseen assailants who seemed to materialize from the darkness only to vanish again. "Apache tactics," Jackson murmured, impressed despite the danger. Two Rivers must have called in reinforcements. They used the confusion to make their way toward the main house, staying low and moving from shadow to shadow. Twice they had to hide as groups of Harmon's men ran past, shouting contradictory orders and firing at phantoms. The main house stood relatively untouched amid the chaos, its windows dark except for a single lamp burning in the downstairs study. As they approached, a figure darted from the shadows of the porch, Rebecca with William clinging to her hand. "Thomas!" the boy cried, breaking free to run to his brother. Thomas caught him in a fierce embrace. "Are you hurt, Squirt?" William shook his head. "No, Colonel Harmon was nice to me. He showed me maps and asked questions about our ranch." "Where is Harmon now?" Jackson asked Rebecca. "Gone," she replied, her face pale in the reflected firelight. When the attack started, he grabbed some papers from his safe and left through a tunnel beneath the house. He took Sheriff Morgan's journal with him. I saw it on his desk. Jackson's heart sank. The evidence that could have brought Harmon to justice was once again beyond reach. "We need to move," he urged. "Head for the meeting point Two Rivers showed us." They had almost reached the south wall when a shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood inches from Jackson's head. He pushed the others down, scanning for the source. Robert Harmon stood 30 yards away, his military revolver aimed with deadly precision. "Sergeant Ward," he called, his voice carrying the same commanding tone Jackson remembered from the war. still interfering in matters beyond your understanding. It's over, Harmon, Jackson called back. Your compound is burning. Your men are scattered. A temporary setback, Harmon replied with chilling confidence. I've survived worse. As have you, apparently. He stepped closer, keeping his revolver trained on the group. I always wondered what happened to you after Willow Creek. The righteous sergeant who couldn't follow orders. Orders to murder innocent civilians, Jackson's voice dripped contempt. No honorable soldier would follow such orders. Harmon laughed, the sound devoid of humor. Honor is a luxury, Ward. Power is what matters. Power and vision. He gestured toward William. The boy has been quite helpful, you know, describing the old maps his father kept. Maps showing the greatest untapped resource in this territory, water. The underground springs, Jackson said, keeping Harmon talking while he assessed their options. An entire network of them, Harmon confirmed. Pure clean water flowing beneath this seemingly barren land. Enough to supply towns, ranches, and most importantly, the railroad, Atim. His eyes gleamed with fervor. Whoever controls that water controls the future of this territory. And gets rich in the process, Thomas added bitterly. Harmon shrugged. Prosperity is the reward for vision. The Southern Pacific will pay handsomely for guaranteed water rights along their route. As he spoke, Jackson noticed a shadow moving behind Harmon Two Rivers, approaching silently with a raised knife. Just a few more seconds of distraction needed. There's more to it than just water, isn't there? Jackson pressed. Something else in those underground springs. Surprise flickered across Harmon's face before he masked it. Very perceptive, Ward. Yes, there's more. Gold microscopic particles suspended in the water deposited over centuries. Not enough to see with the naked eye, but enough to make a man wealthy beyond dreams when properly extracted. Two Rivers was now just feet behind Harmon, poised to strike. You won't get away with this, Jackson said, deliberately cliched to keep Harmon's attention. The territorial governor. Is my business partner? Harmon interrupted with a smirk. Who do you think facilitated my land acquisitions? Why do you think no one investigates the disappearances of stubborn ranchers who won't sell? At that moment, Two Rivers lunged. But Harmon, veteran of countless battles, sensed the attack at the last instant. He pivoted, firing as Two Rivers dove to the side. The Apache warrior was struck, losing his balance and tumbling over the edge of the ridge into the dust and darkness below. Two Rivers, Jackson called out, but no answer came from the shadows. One less Apache, Harmon remarked coldly, turning his attention back to Jackson. Your turn now, Ward. In the chaos that followed, Jackson and the others were forced to retreat without confirming Two Rivers' fate, presuming he couldn't have survived the fall. In the split second of Harmon's distraction, Jackson drew his own revolver and fired. His shot caught Harmon in the shoulder, spinning him around. The colonel staggered but remained standing, returning fire with remarkable accuracy despite his wound. Run, Jackson shouted to the others, providing covering fire as Thomas pulled William toward the wall, Rebecca close behind. Harmon's men, alerted by the gunfire, were converging on their position. Jackson backed away, continuing to fire until his revolver clicked empty. Then he turned and ran, following the Thornton siblings over the wall and into the darkness beyond. They ran until their lungs burned, only stopping when they reached the small creek Two Rivers had designated as their meeting point. There was no sign of the Apache warrior, and Jackson knew with grim certainty that they would not see him again. Did you get the journal back? Thomas asked as they paused to catch their breath. Jackson shook his head. Harmon has it, along with whatever maps and documents he considered valuable enough to save. So we have no evidence, Rebecca said flatly. Nothing to stop him from coming after us again. We have each other, Thomas reminded her, his arm around William's shoulders, and we're alive. For now, Jackson agreed, but we need to keep moving. Head for your ranch, first check on your father. The journey back to the Thornton ranch took most of the night. They traveled cautiously, avoiding main trails and keeping to the shadows. William, exhausted by the ordeal, rode double with Jackson on Senator. As dawn broke, they crested the final rise, overlooking what remained of the Thornton homestead. The main house was a charred ruin, but the barn still stood, smoke-damaged but intact. Home, William whispered, his small voice breaking. But as they approached, Jackson sensed something was wrong. The property was too quiet, with no sign of Mrs. Jenkins, who had been tending to Mike Thornton. Stay back, he warned, dismounting and drawing his revolver. He approached the barn cautiously, every sense alert for danger. The doors stood partially open, creaking slightly in the morning breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. Jackson's stomach clenched as he stepped inside. Hanging from one of the central support beams was Mike Thornton's body, a crude noose around his neck. Beneath him lay Mrs. Jenkins, her throat cut. On the barn wall, written in what could only be blood, was a simple message: "The water or your lives, Harmon." Outside, Rebecca's scream told Jackson she had followed him despite his warning. He turned to find her frozen in the doorway, her eyes fixed on her father's body, her face a mask of pure horror. Behind her, Thomas stood with William's face pressed against his chest, shielding the boy from the gruesome scene. But from the devastation in Thomas's eyes, Jackson knew he had seen enough. In that moment, staring at the aftermath of Harmon's brutality, Jackson felt something shift inside him. The guilt and hesitation that had plagued him since Willow Creek burned away, replaced by cold, clear purpose. This was no longer just about redemption or justice. It was about stopping a monster before he destroyed more innocent lives. As he gently led Rebecca away from her father's body, Jackson made a silent vow. Robert Harmon would pay for his crimes, not just those committed here, but all of them, stretching back to that burning village in Tennessee 20 years ago. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, Harmon's reign of terror would end. They buried Mike Thornton at dawn, laying him to rest beneath the lone cottonwood tree that had survived the fire. Thomas had insisted on digging the grave himself, working through the night with grim determination, each thrust of the shovel fueled by grief and rage. Rebecca stood beside her brother as they lowered their father's body, her face composed but her eyes vacant, as though part of her had died alongside him. William clung to her hand, too young to fully comprehend the finality of death, yet old enough to understand the weight of loss. Jackson stood a respectful distance away, hat in hand, watching the three orphan siblings say goodbye to their father. He felt responsible, though reason told him Harmon would have come for the Thorntons regardless. Mike had refused to sell his land, and in Harmon's world, that alone was a death sentence for bums. As Thomas filled the grave, Rebecca approached Jackson, her movements stiff as though each step required conscious effort. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice hollow. Jackson had been pondering that very question since discovering Mike's body. "Harmon will expect us to run," he said, "or to come after him directly for revenge." "Isn't that what we're going to do?" Thomas demanded, overhearing, as he patted down the final shovelful of earth. "He murdered our father." "Going after Harmon directly would be suicide," Jackson replied. "He has too many men, too many resources. We need allies." "What allies?" Thomas scoffed. "Everyone in the territory is either working for Harmon or too scared to stand against him." "Not everyone," Jackson said. "There are other ranchers who have been pressured to sell. Men and women who've had their water diverted, their cattle rustled, their livelihoods threatened." "And why would they help us when they wouldn't help themselves?" Rebecca asked. Jackson pulled out Sheriff Morgan's journal, which he'd managed to recover during their escape. "Because now we have this, evidence of Harmon's crimes stretching back 20 years. Proof that the territorial governor is complicit in his land-grabbing scheme." "A journal won't stop bullets," Thomas said bitterly. "No," Jackson agreed, "but it might convince others to stand with us. Together we'd have a fighting chance." Rebecca studied Jackson's face, searching for something, hope perhaps, or certainty. "What do you propose? A meeting secret. We gather everyone who's been wronged by Harmon, show them the evidence, form an alliance." "And then what?" Thomas demanded. "We can't exactly march up to Harmon's compound and arrest him." "One step at a time," Jackson cautioned. "First we build our numbers. Then we develop a strategy based on our combined strength." The siblings exchanged glances, a silent communication born of shared blood and hardship. Finally, Thomas nodded. "For Pa," he said simply. "For Pa," Rebecca echoed, with William's small voice joining a heartbeat later. They spent the day salvaging what they could from the ruins of the Thornton Ranch. The house was beyond recovery, but the barn remained structurally sound despite the bloodstains that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. They found a few clothes that had been hanging on the line during the attack, some tools from the shed, and a small cache of ammunition Mike had hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the barn. "Pa always said to prepare for the worst," Thomas explained as he distributed the cartridges. By nightfall, they had established a rudimentary camp in the barn. Jackson took the first watch, sitting in the doorway, with his Winchester across his lap, studying Morgan's journal by lamplight. The sheriff's neat, precise handwriting documented not only the Willow Creek massacre, but also Harmon's more recent crimes, land seizures, facilitated by the territorial governor, water rights, manipulated through fraudulent documents, even several murders disguised as accidents or blamed on Apache raids. Anything useful? Thomas asked, settling beside Jackson with his own rifle. More than I expected, Jackson replied. Morgan was thorough. Names, dates, locations. Even transcriptions of conversations between Harmon and Governor Rawlins. Enough to hang them both. In a proper court, yes, but the territorial court is controlled by Rawlins. Thomas's face hardened. Then what good is it? Information is power, Jackson said. Knowing your enemy's secrets gives you leverage. And Morgan identified potential allies, people who've stood against Harmon and survived. Who? Jackson pointed to a list in the journal. Judge Clayton in Tucson. He's rejected several of Harmon's land claims. A woman named Eleanor Hudson, who owns a large ranch north of here, she fought off Harmon's men twice when they tried to dam her water supply. And a ranger captain named James Calloway, who's been investigating cattle rustling linked to Harmon's operation. Thomas studied the list. Can we trust them? Morgan seemed to think so. And right now, trust is a luxury we can't afford to examine too closely. The next 3 days were spent sending messages to the potential allies Morgan had identified. Jackson dispatched Rebecca to Clayton's Crossing with letters while he and Thomas rode to neighboring ranches under cover of darkness. They arranged a meeting at the abandoned Hayes Mine, 5 miles east of the Thornton property, remote enough to avoid detection, but accessible to those willing to take the risk. On the 4th night, Jackson stood at the entrance to the mine watching as riders approached in ones and twos. He recognized some from Morgan's descriptions: Eleanor Hudson, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, who rode with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle; Sam Cooper, whose small ranch bordered the Thornton property to the west; Martin Reeves, a former cavalry officer whose water had mysteriously dried up after he refused Harmon's offer. In all, 11 people gathered in the dim light of the mine's entrance chamber, their faces skeptical and fearful in equal measure. William had been left at the Hayes cabin with Rebecca standing guard, but Thomas stood at Jackson's side, his hand never far from his revolver. "You're risking your lives by coming here," Jackson began without preamble. "I appreciate your courage." "Save your appreciation," Eleanor Hudson replied dryly. "We came for information, not flattery. Sheriff Morgan's message said you have evidence against Harmon." Jackson held up the journal. Morgan documented everything. Harmon's land seizures, his water rights manipulation, his connection to Governor Rawlins. Morgan, Martin Reeves frowned. The same Sheriff Morgan who's been seen riding with Harmon's men. He was gathering evidence, Jackson explained, playing a dangerous game, pretending to work with Harmon while building a case against him. "Well, and where is Morgan now?" Sam Cooper asked, suspicion evident in his tone. A new voice answered from the shadows behind them. "Right here." The gathered ranchers turned in alarm as Sheriff Morgan limped into the chamber, his left arm in a crude sling, his weathered face pale with pain, but his eyes alert. "You're alive," Jackson said, genuinely surprised. He had assumed Morgan was killed during their escape from Harmon's compound. "Barely, wow," Morgan grimaced. "Mills left me for dead after your escape. Didn't bother to check if I was actually breathing." Thomas raised his rifle. "How do we know you're not still working for Harmon?" "Because Harmon has a price on my head now, same as yours," Morgan replied calmly. "Me $100 dead or alive. Quite the compliment, really." Jackson studied the sheriff carefully. The man's wounds appeared genuine, and his presence here put him at as much risk as the rest of them. Still, caution was warranted. "Why should we trust you?" Jackson asked. "You've been playing both sides for months." "Not both sides," Morgan corrected. "Just one side justice. I've spent years building this case against Harmon, insinuating myself into his confidence, documenting his crimes." He gestured toward the journal in Jackson's hand. "Everything you need is in there. I'm just sorry I couldn't get it to the federal authorities before Harmon discovered my true purpose." Eleanor Hudson stepped forward, her shrewd eyes assessing Morgan. "You're saying you were never Harmon's man?" "I was a doctor before I was a sheriff, Mrs. Hudson," Morgan replied. "I took an oath to do no harm. I've seen firsthand what Harmon is capable of dating back to the war." His gaze shifted to Jackson. "We both have." A murmur ran through the gathered ranchers' uncertainty, giving way to cautious hope. Even if we believe you, Martin Reeves said, what can we possibly do against Harmon? He has an army of hired guns. We're just ranchers, and farmers, and merchants, and townsfolk, Jackson added, all of whom suffer under Harmon's control of the water. Together, we outnumber his men. Numbers aren't everything, Eleanor observed. Harmon's men are killers. Most of us haven't fired a gun in anger. I have, Jackson said quietly. So has Thomas and Morgan. And I'd wager most of you have defended your homes at some point. Sam Cooper nodded reluctantly. Ran off 3 of Harmon's men last month when they tried to poison my well. Shot one myself, Eleanor admitted, when they came for my horses. One by one, each person present shared a story of resistance, of standing against Harmon's encroachment. As they spoke, Jackson saw something kindle in their eyes, not just anger or fear, but resolve. This is about more than just revenge for what Harmon did to the Thorntons, Jackson said when they had finished. It's about the future of this territory. About whether water, the lifeblood of every ranch, every farm, every town, will be controlled by one man for his own profit or shared as it should be. And what exactly do you propose? Eleanor asked, though her tone had shifted from skepticism to interest. Jackson unfolded a rough map of the territory on a flat rock. Harmon's power comes from 3 sources: his armed men, his political connection to Governor Rawlins, and his control of the water. We need to attack on all 3 simultaneously. Morgan stepped forward, pointing to locations on the map. Harmon's men are concentrated here at his main compound, but he also has smaller outposts at strategic points along the water routes. He indicated several spots. These are the dams and diversions he's built to control the flow to various properties. If we destroy those dams, Jackson continued, we restore water to the affected ranches immediately. That weakens Harmon's leverage and strengthens our position. Meanwhile, Morgan added, we need to get this evidence to Judge Clayton in Tucson. He has the authority to issue federal warrants even against the territorial governor. And Harmon himself, Thomas asked, the hunger for vengeance evident in his voice. Will be dealt with, Jackson assured him, but strategically, not through a suicidal frontal assault. The discussion continued for hours, the initial plan refined and expanded as each person contributed their knowledge of the territory of Harmon's operations of potential allies and enemies. By the time the meeting concluded, a tentative alliance had formed, the first real opposition Harmon had faced since establishing his water empire. As the ranchers departed, Morgan pulled Jackson aside. There's something you should know, he said quietly. Something I didn't want to mention in front of the others until I was certain of their loyalty. What is it? Morgan glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. It's about the water sources, the underground springs Harmon is so desperate to control. The gold deposits, Jackson nodded. He mentioned them during our confrontation. It's more than that, Morgan said grimly. Much more. The water in those springs has unique properties, mineral content unlike anything I've seen elsewhere. That's why Harmon has been sending samples to laboratories back east, consulting with mining engineers. What kind of properties? Healing properties for one. Wounds clean faster, infections don't take hold. And the soil irrigated with this water produces crops of exceptional yield and quality. Morgan's expression was grave. But there's something else, something Harmon discovered only recently. The water from the deepest springs contains trace amounts of a mineral unknown to science, a mineral that appears to conduct electricity in ways that defy current understanding. Jackson frowned, struggling to grasp the implications. And that's valuable, potentially revolutionary, Morgan corrected. The engineers Harmon consulted believe it could transform telegraph technology, perhaps even lead to new forms of energy generation. The railroad companies would pay millions for exclusive access. So it's not just about controlling the territory, Jackson realized. It's about controlling something that could change the world. And making himself one of the richest, most powerful men in America in the process, Morgan added. That's why he's willing to commit any atrocity, eliminate any obstacle. The stakes are higher than any of us imagined. A chill ran down Jackson's spine as he processed this new information. They weren't just fighting a land-grabbing tyrant. They were opposing a man with the resources and motivation to crush anyone who stood in his path to unimaginable power. Does anyone else know about this? Jackson asked. The Apache, Morgan replied. Their legends speak of the special water. They've been its guardians for generations, keeping its location secret from outsiders. That's why Harmon massacred that village 3 years ago. He was after their knowledge. Two Rivers mentioned someone named Nahil, Jackson recalled. A chief or war leader who might help us. Morgan nodded. Nahil is the last hereditary chief of the Water Clan. He leads the resistance against Harmon from the mountains. If anyone knows the full truth about the springs, it would be him. Can you arrange a meeting? It won't be easy, Morgan warned. The Apache trust no white men now with good reason. But Two Rivers was Nahil's blood brother. If he vouched for you, Two Rivers is dead, Jackson said quietly. Harmon shot him during our escape. Grief flashed across Morgan's face. Then our path to Nahil is even more difficult, but not impossible. There's a trading post at the edge of Apache territory run by an old frontiersman named Ezekiel Stone. He's one of the few white men the Apache still trade with. He might be able to get a message to Nahil. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, many horses moving fast. Harmon's men, Thomas hissed, appearing beside them with his rifle raised. At least a dozen coming from the south. How did they find us? Morgan wondered aloud, drawing his revolver despite his injured arm. Doesn't matter now, Jackson replied grimly. Everyone inside the mine. We can defend the entrance. The remaining ranchers hurried into the deeper recesses of the abandoned mine, while Jackson, Thomas, and Morgan took positions near the entrance. The approaching riders were still invisible in the darkness, but the thunder of hooves grew louder with each passing second. Surround the mine, a familiar voice shouted. Victor Mills somehow recovered from the beating Jackson had given him at Harmon's compound. They're inside. No one escapes. Gunfire erupted, bullets striking the rock around the mine entrance. Jackson returned fire, his rifle cracking in the night air. Beside him, Thomas fired steadily, each shot carefully placed. There are too many of them, Morgan shouted over the gunfire. We need to retreat deeper into the mine. There's a back exit through the western tunnel. Go, Jackson ordered. Lead the others out. Thomas and I will cover your retreat. Morgan hesitated. You'll be trapped. We'll follow when we can. Now go. As Morgan limped away to guide the ranchers to safety, Jackson and Thomas continued their defense. They had the advantage of cover and elevated position, but Mills' men had numbers and ammunition to spare. We can't hold them for long, Thomas said, ducking as a bullet chipped stone inches from his head. We don't need to, Jackson replied. Just long enough for the others to reach the western tunnel. Minutes stretched like hours as they maintained their fire, forcing Mills' men to keep their distance. Jackson counted his remaining cartridges, 6 in the rifle, 9 in his revolver. Not enough for a prolonged standoff. Time to fall back, he told Thomas. Move deeper into the mine. I'll cover you. Thomas shook his head stubbornly. You go first. I'll cover. This isn't a debate, son, Jackson said firmly. Your sister and brother need you. Move. Something in Jackson's tone must have convinced him. Thomas fired a final shot, then retreated into the darkness of the mine tunnel. Jackson fired his remaining rifle rounds in quick succession, then followed reloading as he ran. The mine was a labyrinth of narrow passages and small chambers, the air thick with dust and the lingering smell of dynamite. They navigated by touch as much as sight, moving steadily toward where Morgan had indicated the western exit should be. Behind them, they could hear Mills' men entering the mine, their shouts echoing off the stone walls. A gunshot rang out, the bullet ricocheting dangerously in the confined space. No shooting, you fools, Mills' voice commanded. You'll bring the whole place down on our heads. Find them. Jackson and Thomas pressed on, feeling their way through the darkness. Ahead, a faint glow suggested moonlight, the western exit, and freedom. As they approached the exit, a figure stepped into their path. Sheriff Morgan, rifle raised. This way, he whispered urgently. The others are already clear. They followed him through a narrow fissure in the rock face that opened onto a small plateau. The gathered ranchers waited with their horses tense and watchful. Everyone made it out, Jackson asked. Morgan nodded. Thanks to your covering fire. But Mills' men will find this exit soon enough. We need to separate, make it harder for them to track us. Quickly, they established rendezvous points and divided into smaller groups. Eleanor Hudson would lead several ranchers north toward her property. Sam Cooper and 2 others would head south to warn additional potential allies. Jackson, Thomas, Morgan, and Martin Reeves would make for the trading post to attempt contact with Nahil. What about Rebecca and William? Thomas asked anxiously. We'll collect them on the way, Jackson assured him. The Hayes cabin is on our route. As the groups prepared to disperse, the crack of a rifle shattered the night's silence. Morgan staggered, blood blossoming on his chest. "Ambush!" someone shouted as more shots rang out. Mills and several of his men had emerged from another mine entrance, catching them in a deadly crossfire. Jackson grabbed the wounded Morgan, dragging him behind a boulder as bullets struck all around them. "Go!" Morgan gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "Take the journal. Get to Nahil." "Not without you," Jackson insisted, returning fire over the boulder's edge. Morgan gripped Jackson's arm with surprising strength. "Listen to me. Harmon isn't the real enemy." "What are you talking about?" "Randall, Edward Randall, Vice President of the Southern Pacific." Morgan's voice was fading, his eyes losing focus. "He's the one. Used Harmon, controlling everything." With a final rattling breath, Sheriff Morgan slumped against the boulder, the life fading from his eyes. In his hand, he clutched a folded paper that had been concealed in his vest, a telegram from Randall to Harmon, confirming Jackson's worst fears. Grief and rage surged through Jackson as he carefully took the telegram and the journal from Morgan's lifeless body. The sheriff had been a good man, trying to right a terrible wrong. His death would not be in vain. "Jackson," Thomas called urgently, "we have to move." The surviving ranchers were mounting up, preparing to scatter in different directions to confuse their pursuers. Jackson ran to Senator, swinging into the saddle as bullets kicked up dust at his horse's hooves. "This way," Martin Reeves shouted, leading them toward a narrow ravine that offered cover from the gunfire. As they galloped into the darkness, Jackson glanced back at the chaotic scene, Morgan's body abandoned by necessity, Mills' men in pursuit, the fragile alliance they had built already fracturing under pressure. The revelation about Edward Randall changed everything. They weren't fighting just a local tyrant, but a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of the railroad, perhaps even to Washington itself. The odds, already long, had just become nearly impossible. Yet as they rode toward the Hayes cabin to collect Rebecca and William, Jackson felt a strange calm settle over him. 20 years ago, he had failed to stop a massacre. Now he had a second chance to stand against evil, not for redemption, but because it was right. Whatever awaited them in the mountains, whatever power Randall and Harmon wielded, Jackson Ward would not fail again. The Hayes cabin was eerily silent as they approached. No lamplight shone from its windows. No smoke rose from its chimney, despite the chill of the desert night. "Something's wrong," Thomas whispered, drawing his revolver. Jackson signaled for him and Martin Reeves to circle around back while he approached the front door. Years of combat had honed his senses, and every instinct warned of danger. The door stood slightly ajar, swinging gently in the night breeze. "Rebecca," Jackson called softly, pushing the door open with the barrel of his rifle. "William," no response came from the darkened interior. Jackson struck a match, its small flame revealing an empty main room undisturbed except for a single chair overturned near the table. No signs of struggle, no blood, just an abandoned cabin and the lingering sense that they had arrived too late. Thomas burst in through the back door, his young face tight with fear. "They're not here." "No horses in the corral either," Martin reported, joining them. "Someone took them." "Or they left voluntarily," Jackson suggested, examining the cabin more carefully. "Rebecca's rifle is gone, and so are the saddlebags we packed with supplies." Thomas picked up something from beside the overturned chair, a small wooden carving of a horse. "This is William's. Pa made it for him years ago. He wouldn't leave it behind willingly." Jackson's heart sank. The carved horse was indeed the same toy William had been playing with at Harmon's compound. The boy had clutched it throughout their escape, refusing to let it go, even as they fled for their lives. "Could they have fled if Harmon's men approached?" Martin asked. "Rebecca would have fought," Thomas insisted. "She wouldn't just abandon our meeting place." Jackson knelt beside the table, noticing something scratched into the wood surface, 3 parallel lines. "This is fresh," he murmured, running his finger over the marks. "Apache sign," Martin said, recognizing the symbol. "Means journey or traveling." "Two Rivers used it when we were tracking the kidnappers," Thomas recalled. "Said it was how Apache scouts marked safe paths." Jackson felt a surge of hope. What if Rebecca and Williams weren't taken by Harmon's men, but by Apache? "Why would Apache take them?" Martin asked skeptically. "Protection, perhaps," Jackson suggested. "If they're allied against Harmon, they might have moved them to safety when they saw Mills' men approaching the Hayes mine." Thomas seized on this possibility. "The trading post. If the Apache took them, that's where they'd go first. It's our best lead, Jackson agreed, already moving toward the door. How far to Stone's trading post, Martin? A hard day's ride northeast in the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains, Martin replied. But it's dangerous country, especially at night. Apache territory. We don't have a choice, Thomas said grimly. Rebecca and William are all the family I have left. They rode through the night, pushing their horses as hard as they dared in the treacherous terrain. Martin Reeves led the way, his cavalry experience evident in how confidently he navigated the darkness. As a former scout, he knew the territory better than most white men, though he admitted they were now in areas he had rarely traveled. The Apache don't welcome intruders, he explained as they paused to rest the horses near dawn. Even during my army days, we avoided these mountains unless absolutely necessary. Yet Stone maintains a trading post here, Jackson observed. Martin nodded. Stone's different. Been here longer than most, respected the Apache ways when others didn't. Still, I wouldn't call him friendly, just tolerated. As the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, they crested a ridge that offered a view of the valley below. There, nestled against the base of a rocky bluff, stood a collection of log buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade, Stone's trading post. No smoke from the chimneys, Thomas noted with concern. And the gates are closed, Martin added, unusual for this time of day. Stone normally opens at first light for early travelers. They approach cautiously, alert for any sign of ambush or danger. The trading post remained silent, giving no indication whether friends or enemies awaited within. Hello, the post, Martin called when they were within hailing distance. Ezekiel Stone. It's Martin Reeves from Clayton's Crossing. No response came from behind the wooden walls. The three men exchanged worried glances. Circle around, Jackson suggested. Look for track signs of recent activity. And they split up, Thomas taking the western perimeter while Martin checked the eastern side. Jackson approached the main gate, directly studying the ground for clues. The dust showed numerous hoof prints and boot tracks, but most appeared to be at least a day old. Jackson, Thomas called urgently from around the western wall. There's a back entrance here. It's open. Jackson hurried to join him, finding a small gate ajar in the rear palisade. Fresh tracks led both in and out, several people on foot, moving with purpose. Recent, Jackson confirmed, noting the clarity of the prints in the morning dew. Within the last few hours. With weapons drawn, they entered the compound. The trading post consisted of several buildings arranged around a central yard. The main structure housed the store itself, while smaller outbuildings served as storerooms, a stable, and living quarters. The yard was deserted, but the door to the main building stood open. Inside, they found chaos: shelves, overturned merchandise scattered across the floor, a broken lamp pooling oil on the counter. Looks like a struggle, Martin observed, examining a bloodstain on the floorboards. Or a hasty departure, Jackson countered, noting that valuable items like ammunition and tobacco remained untouched. This wasn't a robbery. In the back room, they discovered what remained of Ezekiel Stone. The old trade-in lay sprawled beside his desk, a single bullet hole in his forehead. The killing had been professional execution style. Harmon's work, Thomas growled, his young face hardening with renewed hatred. Jackson knelt beside the body, noting details that didn't align with Thomas's conclusion. The bullet entered from the front, not the back. Stone saw his killer coming. So, Harmon's men typically shoot from ambush. This was different, colder. As Jackson rose, he noticed a small wooden box partially concealed beneath the desk. He retrieved it, finding it locked but lightweight. Something inside shifted as he moved it. What's that? Martin asked. Not sure, Jackson replied, examining the box more carefully. The lock was simple, easily defeated with the blade of his knife. Inside, they found a folded piece of deerskin covered in unfamiliar symbols and drawings. It's an Apache map, Martin said with surprise. Old style, using natural landmarks rather than distances. Can you read it? Thomas asked eagerly. Martin shook his head. Only Apache medicine men and chiefs are taught to interpret these fully, but I recognize this symbol here. He pointed to a distinctive mountain peak drawn on the skin. That's Eagle's Head in the Dragoon Range, and this, he indicated a series of wavy lines, represents water flowing underground. Jackson felt a surge of excitement. The underground springs Harmon's been searching for. Possibly, Martin agreed. But without someone who can read the full map, we can't be certain where it leads. Someone like Nahal, Jackson concluded. The Apache chief Morgan mentioned. As they contemplated their next move, a sound from outside caught their attention. Horses approaching, moving fast. They hurried to the windows expecting to see Harmon's men or perhaps Apache warriors. Instead, they were shocked to see Rebecca galloping into the yard, her face flushed with exertion and fear. Alone. Thomas rushed outside to meet his sister as she dismounted. "Rebecca, where's William? What happened?" She collapsed into her brother's arms, exhaustion finally overtaking her. "Apache. They came to the cabin, warned us about Harmon's men." "Where's William?" Thomas repeated, his voice rising with panic. "They took him to their village, said he'd be safer there." She looked up at Jackson as he approached. "A warrior named Nahil led them, said he knew 2 rivers, said to tell you that the water calls." Jackson and Martin exchanged significant glances. "Nahil came himself?" Martin asked, clearly surprised. "The chief rarely leaves the mountains these days." Rebecca nodded weakly. "He said William reminds him of his son, lost in the massacre." She gripped Thomas's arm. "I tried to stay with him, but Nahil insisted I find you, bring you to them." "Where?" Jackson asked urgently. "A place they call Silent Waters, in the high mountains." Rebecca's voice was fading as exhaustion claimed her. "Nahil said only the map can guide us." Jackson held up the deerskin map they'd found in Stone's box. "This map." Rebecca's eyes widened in recognition. "Yes, Stone was supposed to give it to you. How did you—" "Stone is dead," Jackson informed her grimly. "Murdered not by Harmon's men, I think. Someone else." "Randall," Martin suggested. "If what Morgan told you is true, the railroad vice president wouldn't want anyone finding the springs before him." Rebecca struggled to stay conscious, fighting against her body's demands for rest. "There's more. William told me about the maps Pa had hidden." "What maps?" Thomas asked. "Survey maps, from the original territorial survey 30 years ago." Rebecca's voice was barely audible now. "Hidden in the old well at our ranch. Pa never trusted banks." Jackson helped Thomas guide Rebecca to a bench. "Rest now," he urged her. "We'll get those maps, then find William and Nahil." As Rebecca finally surrendered to sleep, Jackson, Thomas, and Martin withdrew to plan their next move. "We need those survey maps," Jackson decided. "They might contain information about the underground springs that complements the Apache map." "Returning to the Thornton Ranch is dangerous," Martin warned. "Harmon will have men watching it." "I'll go alone," Thomas volunteered. "I know exactly where Pa hid things in the well. I can be in and out before anyone spots me." Jackson shook his head. "Too risky. We stay together." He turned to Martin. "Can you guide us to this Silent Waters with just the Apache map?" Martin studied the deerskin thoughtfully. "I can get us into the mountains, but beyond that, these symbols grow more complex. Without someone who reads Apache medicine, signs we could wander for weeks." "Then we need both," Jackson concluded. "The survey maps and whatever knowledge Nahil possesses. Our best chance is to recover the maps, then find Nahil, Bo, and William." As they prepared to depart gathering supplies from Stone's inventory, Jackson found himself drawn to a small office at the rear of the trading post. Inside, a crude desk held ledgers documenting Stone's business transactions. Among them, Jackson discovered a journal similar to Morgan's, but older and worn with years of use. The journal contained Stone's observations spanning decades, including detailed notes about the Apache water sources and their unique properties. Stone had been more than just a trader. He had been a naturalist, carefully documenting the flora, fauna, and geology of the region. One passage in particular caught Jackson's attention. "The water from the deepest spring, what the Apache call Silent Waters, exhibits property unlike any I have encountered elsewhere. Iron left in this water does not rust, but instead develops a curious blue patina that conducts electricity with remarkable efficiency. Moreover, wounds bathed in this water heal with unprecedented speed, and seeds irrigated with it yield crops of extraordinary size and vitality. The Apache believe the water is alive, possessing both healing and destructive powers, depending on the heart of the one who approaches it." Another entry dated just 3 months earlier proved even more alarming. Colonel Harmon visited again today, this time with a man he introduced as Edward Randall from the Southern Pacific Railroad. Their questions about the springs grow more specific, more technical. They brought water samples collected from various locations, asking me to identify which most closely resembled the Silent Waters. I feigned ignorance, but Randall was not deceived. He offered a sum that would tempt most men to betray their own mothers. When I refused, I saw something in his eyes colder than any killer's gaze I've encountered in my 60 years on the frontier. I fear my days are numbered. Stone's prescient words sent a chill down Jackson's spine. The old trader had known too much and paid with his life. Now the knowledge he had protected had fallen to them, along with the danger it represented. As Jackson rejoined the others, he found Rebecca awake but still weak. She had washed the dust from her face and changed into clean clothes from Stone's inventory, but exhaustion had etched deep lines around her eyes. "We're leaving in an hour," Jackson informed her. "Will you be able to ride?" She nodded determinedly. "William needs us. I won't slow you down." The fire in her eyes reminded Jackson painfully of Elizabeth during their son's illness, the same unyielding strength in the face of impossible odds. He handed her Stone's journal. "You should read this. It explains why Harmon and Randall want your land so desperately." As Rebecca read, her expression shifted from confusion to dawning understanding. This water, it could transform the territory, the whole country, and make Randall and Harmon wealthy beyond imagination, Jackson added. Power, not just wealth, control over something that could change the course of progress itself. "And my father died for it," she said quietly, "as did Morgan and Stone. And 2 rivers," Jackson reminded her, "and countless Apache before him. This war has been fought in shadows for years. Now it's coming into the light." They departed Stone's trading post as the sun reached its zenith, leaving the old trader's body covered with respect, a promise made to return and provide proper burial when circumstances allowed. Their path would take them first to the Thornton Ranch to recover the survey maps, then into the mountains to find Nahil and William at the place called Silent Waters. As they rode, Jackson studied the Apache map, trying to decipher its mysterious symbols and landmarks. The mountain called Eagle's Head was clearly marked, as were the underground watercourses flowing beneath it. But other symbols, spirals, handprints, animal figures remained enigmatic, their meanings known only to those initiated into Apache spiritual traditions. The journey to the Thornton Ranch was tense, every ridge and arroyo potentially concealing Harmon's men or other dangers. They approached at dusk, using the gathering shadows for cover as they surveyed the property from a distance. 2 riders near the barn, Martin reported, lowering his field glass. "Harmon's men, most likely, keeping watch." "Any others?" Jackson asked. "None visible, but there could be more inside what's left of the house." Thomas studied the scene, his face grim. "The well is behind the barn. We'll need to neutralize those guards without raising an alarm." "I'll handle that," Jackson decided. "You and Martin circle around to approach from the east. Rebecca, stay with the horses. If you hear shooting, ride for the mountains. Don't wait for us." Rebecca began to protest, but Jackson cut her off. "William needs at least one of us to reach him. Promise me." After a moment's hesitation, she nodded reluctantly. "Be careful, all of you." Jackson approached the ranch using the dry creek bed that ran along its western edge. Years of stalking enemies through the forests of Tennessee and Virginia during the war had taught him how to move silently, how to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder upon it. The guards were careless, confident in their isolation. One smoked a cigarette, its ember glowing like a beacon in the deepening twilight. The other had dozed off, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Neither noticed Jackson's approach until it was too late. The first guard died silently, Jackson's knife finding the vital spot beneath his ribs with surgical precision. The second had time only for a startled gasp before the same blade ended his protest permanently. Jackson signaled to Thomas and Martin, who emerged from the shadows to join him. Together they moved to the well, a simple stone structure, now partially collapsed from the fire that had consumed the main house. "The maps are hidden in a cavity beneath the third stone from the bottom on the north side," Thomas explained, already beginning to remove stones from the well's outer wall. Working quickly, they excavated the hidden cache. Inside a waterproof oilskin pouch, they found several folded documents. The original territorial survey maps, yellowed with age, but still legible. As Thomas spread them out, Jackson saw that they documented not just the surface features of the land, but also geological formations beneath. Notes in the margins, written in a careful hand, detailed the presence of underground water sources, mineral deposits, and unusual geological phenomena. "Look here," Martin pointed to an area marked with a distinctive symbol. "This matches the location on the Apache map, Eagle's Head Mountain. And these lines," he traced a network of blue markings that spread like veins beneath the surface. These must be the underground watercourses. And this, Thomas added, indicating a point where several watercourses converged, must be the mainspring silent waters. Jackson compared the survey map to the Apache skin map. Though the symbols and style differed dramatically, the essential geography aligned perfectly. Together, they provided a comprehensive guide to the hidden water network and to the precious spring Harmon and Randall coveted so desperately. "We have what we need," Jackson said, carefully refolding the maps. "Now we find Nahilwe and William." As they turned to leave, a familiar voice froze them in place. "I'll take those maps, Ward." Sheriff Morgan stood at the entrance to the barn, his revolver trained on Jackson's chest. But this wasn't the Morgan who had died in their arms at the mine. This was a different man entirely, same face, same build, but eyes that held none of the integrity or compassion of the sheriff they had known. "You're not Morgan," Jackson said, his mind racing to understand this impossible situation. The man smiled coldly. "Daniel Morgan was my twin brother. He always was the self-righteous one of the family. I'm Samuel Morgan, formerly Captain Morgan of Army Intelligence, now Special Agent for the Southern Pacific Railroad." "You killed your own brother," Thomas gasped in horror. "He killed himself," Samuel Morgan replied without emotion, "choosing to side with ranchers and savages against progress, against the future." He gestured with his revolver. "The map's Ward, now." "And if I refuse," Jackson asked, calculating distances, angles, chances. "Instead of trusting me, trust this," Morgan said coldly, drawing a concealed pistol from inside his coat. "I'll be taking those maps, Ward." In that dangerous moment, a shot rang out, but not from Morgan's gun. Surprise registered on his face as blood bloomed across his chest. Morgan staggered, turning to see Rebecca standing in the barn doorway, smoke still rising from the barrel of the revolver in her hand. "For my father," Rebecca said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. Morgan collapsed, blood flowing from the mortal wound. "You don't understand," he gasped. "Randall won't stop. He'll burn this whole territory to get what he wants. The water, it changes everything." With those cryptic words, Samuel Morgan drew his final breath, the light fading from his eyes, a mirror image of his twin brother's death, but with a soul as different as night from day. "We need to move," Jackson urged, gathering the maps. "If Morgan found us, others won't be far behind." They fled into the gathering darkness, riding hard for the mountains that loomed on the eastern horizon. Behind them, the Thornton Ranch faded into shadow, its secrets now carried with them into the unknown. As they climbed into the foothills, Jackson felt the weight of responsibility pressing upon him. William's life, the fate of the Thornton siblings, perhaps even the future of the territory itself now depended on their finding Nahil and the mysterious silent waters. And somewhere behind them, Robert Harmon and Edward Randall pursued men of wealth and power, willing to commit any atrocity to control a resource that could reshape the world. The real war was just beginning. The journey to silent waters tested their endurance to its limits. They rode through increasingly treacherous terrain as they ascended into the Dragoon Mountains, narrow trails skirting sheer drops and dense thickets that tore at clothes and skin. On the third day, they entered a hidden valley nestled high in the mountains. A crystal-clear stream wound through its center, feeding a small lake. Along the valley's edges, several dozen Wickiups, traditional Apache dwellings, housed what appeared to be an entire clan. "William," Rebecca called, suddenly spurring her horse forward as she spotted her young brother emerging from a large central Wickiup. The boy ran to his sister, his face lighting with joy, as she dismounted and swept him into her arm. "You're safe," she murmured, holding him tightly. "They've been nice to me," William assured her. "Nahil showed me how to make arrows and track deer." Thomas joined them, embracing his siblings with fierce protectiveness. "No one hurt you. You're really all right," William nodded enthusiastically. "I've been fine, but I missed you both." His expression grew solemn. "Is Pa—" The shadow that crossed Thomas's face answered before his words could. "Pa's gone, William. Harmon's men killed him." The boy's face crumpled, grief overtaking excitement. Nahil, a powerfully built man with a face lined by sun and battle, approached Jackson. "We talk now," he said, gesturing toward the central Wickiup. "Bring the woman and the older boy." Inside, an elderly medicine man named Dakota was already seated, the map spread before him on a woven mat. "I am Nahil, war chief of the Water Clan." Nahil introduced himself formally as they settled around the fire. This is Dakota, our medicine man and keeper of sacred knowledge. Jackson inclined his head respectfully. Jackson Ward, these are Rebecca and Thomas Thornton. Two Rivers spoke of you before he died, Nahil said. Said you fought against Harmon at Willow Creek. Said you tried to save innocent ones. I did, Jackson confirmed, but I failed. Too many died because I didn't act soon enough. Yet you acted, Nahil observed. Now you bring these maps to us. Why, to protect the water sources from Harmon and Randall, Jackson replied honestly. What happens now? Thomas asked impatiently. We've brought the maps as requested. Will you help us stop Harmon and Randall? Nahil's expression hardened. White men's problems. Why should Apache fight white men's war? Because it's your war too, Jackson pointed out. Harmon massacred your people to find these water sources. Randall will finish what Harmon started if he gets the chance. Then we kill them all, Nahil said simply. Burn their ranches, destroy their dams, drive them from our lands. And bring the full might of the U.S. Army down on your people, Jackson countered. How many more Apache will die then? Anger flashed in Nahil's dark eyes. You speak of peace while your kind steals our land, poisons our water, kills our people. Not peace, Jackson clarified. Justice. Legal justice that stops Harmon and Randall without starting a war that will destroy your clan. White man's justice is no justice for Apache. Nahil spat. Dakota raised a gnarled hand. The water speaks to both of you, he said cryptically, but you listen with different ears. He traced a finger along the interconnected waterways shown on the survey map. These waters have flowed beneath these mountains since before the first Apache walked this land. They will flow long after the last white man has returned to dust. His finger came to rest at Silent Waters. This place has power beyond your understanding, Jackson Ward. It gives life, it takes life, it heals, it destroys, all depending on the heart of the one who approaches. The mineral in the water, Jackson said, recalling Stone's journal. That's what Randall wants, isn't it? Not just water for the railroad, but the special properties of the water itself. Dakota nodded. The blue stone that grows in the deepest pool. What you call mineral, we call the blood of Mother Earth. For generations, we have been its guardians. Jackson turned to Nahil. Then we have common cause, whether you call it justice or vengeance. Harmon and Randall must be stopped. After a long moment, Nahil spoke. Two paths lie before us. The path of war, swift, bloody, final. Or the path you suggest, slower, using white man's laws against white man's greed. He fixed Jackson with a challenging stare. Why should I trust your path over mine? Because I've walked the path of war, Jackson replied quietly. I've seen what it does not just to the enemy, but to the warrior himself. The blood never washes clean, Nahil. Something in Jackson's words seemed to reach the Apache chief. His stern expression softened. And what is your plan? How do white man's laws stop men like Harmon and Randall? Jackson reached for Morgan's journal. This contains evidence of their crimes not just against Yara people, but against territorial law, federal law, even military law. He opened the journal, pointing to specific entries. The problem is some of this information is encoded. Morgan used a military cipher to protect certain names and locations. Where is this key? Nahil asked. I believe Morgan hid it somewhere in the journal itself, Jackson explained. Rebecca examined the journal's worn leather cover carefully. There, she said triumphantly, indicating a nearly invisible seam in the inside back cover. Using the tip of her knife, she carefully separated the layers of leather, revealing a thin sheet of paper folded to the size of a playing card. The cipher key, Jackson confirmed. For the next hour, they worked to decode the journal's most critical passages. What emerged was damning. Morgan had documented not merely corruption, but conspiracy to commit murder fraud on a massive scale, and even treason. Randall had been secretly negotiating with foreign investors, promising them control of the territory's water. This is enough to bring down not just Harmon and Randall, but Governor Rawlins himself, Jackson concluded. If we can get it to the right authorities, Thomas added skeptically. Judge Clayton in Tucson has jurisdiction over federal matters, Jackson replied. According to Morgan's notes, Clayton has been investigating Rawlins for months. Tucson is 3 days' hard ride, Rebecca pointed out. Harmon's men control all the routes. Not all routes, Nahil interjected. Apache no paths, no white man is seen. I can take you to Tucson unseen. Then you'll help us, Jackson asked hopefully. Nihil nodded once sharply. For 2 rivers, for my people, for the sacred waters. His expression remained stern. But know this, if your white man's justice fails, we return to Apache justice. Blood for blood. As they finalized their plans, a young Apache warrior burst into the wickiup speaking rapidly in his native tongue. Nahil's expression darkened as he listened. What is it? Jackson asked. Riders approaching the valley, Nahil translated grimly. Many riders. Harmon's men. How did they find us? Thomas demanded. The twin, Dakota said. Before death, he sent a message. Samuel Morgan, Rebecca realized. He must have tracked us to the trading post and sent word to Harmon. How many riders? Jackson asked. 20, maybe more, with pack animals and supplies. A full expedition, Jackson concluded. Harmon isn't just coming to eliminate us, he's coming for Silent Waters itself. Nahil barked orders. Outside, they could hear the camp erupting into organized chaos as warriors prepared for battle. We must move, Nahil announced. Take the boy and the maps to Silent Waters. It is the most defensible position. And the evidence? Jackson asked, indicating Morgan's journal. Split it, Rebecca suggested. I'll take the journal to Tucson with Thomas. You go with Nahil and William to Silent Waters. Too dangerous, Jackson objected. We should stay together. We don't have time to argue, Thomas insisted. Rebecca's right, we need to divide Harmon's forces. If we all go to Silent Waters, we risk losing everything. Jackson reluctantly agreed. Take Martin with you. He knows the territory better than either of you. And take the decoded pages, not the original journal that stays with me as insurance. As they hurriedly copied the evidence, Jackson studied the Apache map more carefully. The design on Samuel Morgan's ring, he murmured. It matched this pattern of converging waterways. A secret society, Nahil suggested. Men who share knowledge power. Or a marker, Jackson theorized. How long has Randall been interested in these waters? Many years, the chief replied, before Harmon came to the territory. What if Harmon isn't working for Randall? What if they're both working for someone else, someone we haven't identified yet? That would explain why Samuel Morgan was willing to kill his own brother, Rebecca reasoned. Not just for money, but for loyalty to something bigger. The wailing of a sentry horn interrupted their speculation. Harmon's men had been spotted. No more time, Nahil declared. We move now. William ran to join them, his young face a mixture of excitement and fear. You'll go with Mr. Ward and Nahil to a safe place, Rebecca told him, kneeling to his level. Thomas and I have to deliver an important message. We're splitting up, William's voice quavered, but we just found each other again. Only for a little while, Thomas assured him. We'll meet you at Silent Waters as soon as our task is done. William bit his lip, fighting tears. Promise. Promise, Rebecca and Thomas said in unison, each embracing their youngest sibling. The sound of distant gunfire lent urgency to their farewells. Go, Jackson urged Rebecca and Thomas. Martin is waiting with the horses. Take the eastern trail, it's the least likely to be watched. And you, Rebecca asked, concern evident in her eyes. We'll head north to Silent Waters, Jackson replied. If all goes well, we'll meet you there in 5 days. And if it doesn't go well, Thomas asked quietly. Jackson met his gaze steadily. Then make sure that evidence reaches Judge Clayton. Whatever happens, Harmon and Randall must not win. The siblings exchanged one final embrace before Rebecca and Thomas departed. Jackson watched them go, a sense of foreboding settling over him. They have warrior hearts, Nahil commented, like their father. That's what worries me, Jackson admitted. Courage isn't always enough. The journey to Silent Waters took them deep into the most rugged section of the Dragoon Mountains. By the 3rd day, they had entered territory so remote that Jackson doubted any white man had ever set foot there. The vegetation changed, becoming lusher, more vibrant than seemed possible in the arid southwest. Late that afternoon, they crested a final ridge and beheld Silent Waters for the first time. Unlike the hidden valley where the Apache camp had been situated, this was a small box canyon, accessible only through a narrow entrance. Sheer cliffs rose on 3 sides, their stratified layers gleaming red and gold in the setting sun. At the canyon's center lay a perfectly circular pool, perhaps 30 feet in diameter. The water was so still, so clear, that it appeared more like polished glass than liquid. Silent Waters, Nahil announced with reverence. sacred center, place of healing and judgment. As they established camp near the canyon entrance, Jackson studied their surroundings. The canyon's natural defenses were formidable, but not impregnable. "How long can we hold here if Harmon finds us?" he asked Nahil. "Days, perhaps a week," the chief replied. "Depends on how many men he brings." Later that night, as William slept, Jackson examined Morgan's journal more thoroughly. One entry caught his attention. "Harmon maintains the facade of the ruthless commander, but beneath lies a man haunted by his past. When drunk, he speaks of Willow Creek not with pride, but with tortured justification. He seeks absolution through power, believing that if his actions lead to prosperity and progress, history will judge him more kindly." Another entry provided insight into Randall. Unlike Harmon, who kills from a twisted sense of necessity, Randall views human life as merely another resource to be exploited or discarded according to its utility. The man displays all the characteristics of what alienists term a moral imbecile, entirely devoid of conscience or empathy. Jackson considered these psychological profiles alongside the tactical situation. Dakota settled beside him. "You seek a path that does not exist," he observed cryptically. "What path is that?" Jackson asked. "The path without sacrifice," the old man replied. "Every great change requires blood. The only question is, whose blood will be spilled?" "Is there another way?" Jackson asked. "The water knows," Dakota said, gesturing toward the silent pool. "It judges according to the heart's true nature." With dawn brought clear skies and an unexpected development. One of the Apache sentries reported riders approaching from the east. Rebecca and Thomas, accompanied by Martin Reeves and a man in the uniform of a U.S. Marshal. They made it to Tucson, Jackson realized with relief. But as the riders drew closer, Jackson's concern grew. They were riding hard, too hard for a simple return journey, and behind them dust clouds suggested pursuit. Harmon Nahil confirmed using a brass spyglass. At least 15 riders moving fast. "Get William to safety," Jackson ordered. "Hide him in the cave. Dakota showed us yesterday." Rebecca reached them first, her horse lathered with exertion, her face streaked with dust and what looked like dried blood. "Harmon's right behind us," she gasped. "We barely stayed ahead of them from Tucson." Thomas and Martin arrived moments later, followed by the marshal, a weathered man in his 50s with the hard eyes of someone who had seen his share of frontier justice. "Marshal James Calloway," he introduced himself curtly. "Judge Clayton sent me with a federal warrant for Robert Harmon and Edward Randall." He surveyed the canyon. "This the place they're after." "Silent waters," Jackson confirmed. "The evidence reached Judge Clayton." Thomas nodded. "He issued the warrants immediately, but someone warned Randall he had already fled Tucson, and Harmon intercepted us on the return journey." "The council," Jackson surmised. Morgan's journal mentioned their influence throughout the territory. "We lost 2 marshals in the ambush." Calloway added the hard line of his jaw, betraying his anger. "How close is Harmon?" Jackson asked. "An hour, maybe less," Martin estimated. "They have fresh horses. Ours are nearly spent." "Can your warriors delay them at the canyon entrance?" Jackson asked Nahil. The chief nodded. "For a time, but they have the big gun on wheels." "The Gatling," Calloway confirmed grimly. 50 caliber mounted on a modified wagon. "Then we don't defend at the entrance," Jackson decided. "We let them enter the canyon, then trap them inside." As they hastily prepared their defenses, William was brought back at Jackson's request. "It's going to be dangerous here soon," Jackson explained, kneeling to meet William's eyes. "You can stay hidden in the cave, or you can go with Dakota to a safe place further in the mountains." William glanced toward where Rebecca and Thomas were checking their weapons. "I want to stay with my family." "They need to focus on the fight," Jackson said gently. "Knowing you're safe will help them do that." The boy considered this with a maturity beyond his years. "Will you protect them like you protected me?" "With my life," Jackson promised. William nodded solemnly. "Then I'll go with Dakota, but you have to promise to bring Rebecca and Thomas to me when it's over." "I promise," Jackson said, the weight of that vow settling heavily on his shoulders. As Dakota led William away, Jackson rejoined the others at their defensive positions. The sun had reached its zenith, beating down mercilessly on the canyon. In the distance, they could hear the approach of Harmon's force. "Remember," Jackson instructed, "Harmon will expect resistance at the entrance. He won't expect us to let him penetrate so deeply into the canyon. And if he doesn't take the bait, Thomas asked. Then we fall back to plan two, Jackson replied. Direct confrontation at the pool itself. The water will decide, Nahil stated with fatalistic confidence. The first riders appeared at the canyon entrance, scouts moving cautiously, rifles ready. They paused, surprised by the lack of resistance. After a brief consultation, one rode back, while the other remained watching. Minutes later, the main force arrived. Robert Harmon sat astride his black stallion, every inch the military commander despite his civilian clothes. Beside him rode Victor Mills, his face still bearing the marks of his encounter with Jackson. Behind them came the Gatling gun, mounted on a reinforced wagon and operated by two men. Jackson held his breath as Harmon surveyed the canyon entrance. This was the critical moment. Would he suspect a trap, or would his arrogance lead him forward? After a brief consultation with Mills, Harmon gave the order to advance. The force moved into the canyon, the wagon with its deadly cargo rumbling over the rocky ground. Not yet, Jackson whispered to Thomas, who had positioned himself nearby with a clear shot at Harmon. Wait until they're fully committed. Harmon halted his force about 50 yards from the pool. He studied the silent water with evident satisfaction, then turned to address his men. Gentlemen, his voice carried clearly in the canyon's acoustics, before you lies the future of this territory, perhaps of the nation itself. Control of this water means control of everything that follows. The railroad, the towns that will spring up along its route, the industries that will follow. He gestured expansively. All of it begins here today with our claim to silent waters. Jackson signaled to Nahel and the others the moment had come. As one, they rose from their hiding places, rifles trained on Harmon's force. Robert, Harmon, Jackson called, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. You're surrounded. Throw down your weapons. Harmon's head snapped up, his expression shifting from triumph to fury as he realized the trap he had ridden into. Mills immediately drew his revolver, scanning the rim for targets. I have a federal warrant for your arrest, Marshal Calloway announced, stepping forward with badge displayed. Surrender peacefully and you'll receive a fair trial. For a moment it seemed Harmon might comply. Then his face hardened with resolve. Open fire, he commanded. Kill them all. The canyon erupted in gunfire. Jackson's first shot took down one of the Gatling gunners, but the other managed to bring the weapon to bear, its distinctive mechanical rattle, sending a stream of bullets toward the defenders' positions. Rebecca, showing remarkable courage, darted from cover to cover, firing her rifle with deadly accuracy. She downed two of Harmon's men in quick succession before being forced back by the Gatling's withering fire. Thomas, meanwhile, had worked his way to a position directly above the Gatling wagon. With a prayer for steady hands, he took careful aim at the remaining gunner. His shot found its mark, sending the man sprawling across the weapon's controls. With the Gatling temporarily silenced, Jackson focused on Harmon himself. The colonel had dismounted and taken cover behind a large boulder, directing his men with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned commander. Mills, Jackson heard him shout, take 3 men and flank them from the west wall. Jackson caught Nahil's eye, signaling the danger. The Apache chief nodded, dispatching 2 warriors to intercept Mills before he could outflank their position. For nearly an hour, the battle raged across the canyon. Both sides suffered casualties. 2 Apache warriors fell to lucky shots, while Harmon lost at least 5 men to the defender's superior position. The Gatling gun, its operator dead, sat silent and useless in the middle of the battlefield. Then, in a moment that would later seem ordained by fate itself, William appeared at the edge of the pool. He had somehow slipped away from Dakota and returned to the canyon, drawn perhaps by concern for his siblings. William! Rebecca screamed in horror, seeing her young brother exposed in the open. Harmon spotted the boy immediately. Hold your fire, he ordered his men, then stepped from behind, his cover pistol raised. Nobody move, or the boy dies. The battlefield fell silent, all eyes on the tableau at the pool's edge. William stood frozen, his young face a mask of terror, as Harmon approached him cautiously. Jackson, from his position on the canyon rim, had a clear shot at Harmon, but couldn't risk it with William so close. It's over, Harmon, Jackson called. Let the boy go. There's no way out for you. On the contrary, Harmon replied, reaching William and pulling the boy roughly against him as a shield. I'm walking out of here with the boy. Anyone tries to stop me, he dies first. To everyone's surprise, it was Mills who spoke next. Colonel, the boy's innocent, he said, stepping forward cautiously. This isn't Willow Creek. Harmon's face contorted with rage. You dare question me, Mills, after all these years? I've followed you loyally, sir, Mills replied, through hell and back. But this, he gestured toward William, this isn't right. Since when did you develop a conscience? Harmon sneered. You had no problem executing women and children at Willow Creek. And I've paid for it every night since, Mills admitted, his voice barely audible across the canyon. The nightmares never stop. Jackson, seeing Harmon momentarily distracted by Mills's unexpected defiance, began moving along the rim, working his way to a better position. The water judges, Nahil murmured beside him. Watch. Confused, Jackson returned his attention to the scene below. Something strange was happening. The previously still surface of the pool had begun to ripple, though there was no wind. The ripples spread outward from the center, growing larger, more pronounced. Harmon, still holding William, had backed up until his boots touched the edge of the pool. Stay back, he warned as Mills took another step toward him. I'll kill the boy. No, you won't, Mills said with sudden certainty, because you're not a monster, Colonel. You never were. Just a man who made terrible choices and couldn't find his way back. The water behind Harmon began to churn more violently, though he remained oblivious to it, focused entirely on Mills's approach. One more step and I'll shoot him, Harmon threatened, pressing his pistol into William's temple. What happened next would later be recounted differently by each witness. Some would say the ground shifted beneath Harmon's feet. Others would insist that tendrils of water reached up to grasp his ankles. Jackson himself would never be certain whether what he saw was reality or the product of exhaustion and battle stress. What no one disputed was the result. Robert Harmon lost his footing at the pool's edge. As he fell backward, his grip on William loosened. Mills lunged forward, pulling the boy to safety just as Harmon plunged into the churning waters. A terrible scream erupted from Harmon as he thrashed in the pool, not the scream of a drowning man, but of one experiencing something far worse. The water around him boiled and frothed, turning an unnatural blue-black color that seemed to glow from within. The water judges, Dakota intoned, appearing suddenly at Jackson's side, as it has always judged. Within moments, Harmon's struggles ceased. The pool's surface calmed, returning to its mirror-like stillness. Of Colonel Robert Harmon, there was no sign, no body, no clothing, nothing to indicate he had ever existed. A stunned silence fell over the canyon. Harmon's remaining men, witnessing their leader's inexplicable fate, threw down their weapons without further prompting. As Jackson descended to the canyon floor, he found Mills sitting on a rock, his head in his hands, William standing awkwardly beside him. He saved me, the boy said simply as Jackson approached. Mills looked up, his face haggard with exhaustion and what might have been relief. I couldn't let it happen again, he said. Not to another child. Harmon, Jackson asked, glancing toward the now placid pool. Mills shook his head in bewilderment. I've never seen anything like it. It was as if the water was alive, judging him. Rebecca and Thomas rushed to William, enveloping him in a protective embrace. Marshal Calloway approached more sedately, surveying the aftermath of the battle with a professional eye. I've got 16 prisoners to transport back to Tucson, he observed, and a report to write that no one in Washington will believe. What about Randall? Jackson asked. He's the real power behind all this. Judge Clayton's already wired the federal marshals in San Francisco, Calloway replied. They'll be waiting when his train arrives. And the water? Thomas asked, glancing toward Silent Waters. What happens to it now? Nahil joined them, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. The water belongs to no man, he stated. It is for all who respect its power. He fixed Jackson with a meaningful look. Your government will want to claim it, study it, control it. Not if the evidence proves it's on Apache land, Jackson replied. Morgan's journal and the original survey maps show this entire area was designated as Apache territory in the original treaty. Calloway nodded thoughtfully. Judge Clayton's an honest man. With the right evidence, he could establish a federal protection order for this entire region. A reservation? Nahil asked skeptically. A sanctuary, Jackson suggested instead, for both your people and the water, protected by federal law from development or exploitation. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon, Jackson stood at the edge of Silent Waters. The surface reflected the deepening sky stars beginning to appear in its perfect mirror. Mills approached hesitantly, standing at a respectful distance. What happens to me now, Ward? I've got blood on my hands that won't ever wash clean. Jackson studied the man who had once been his enemy. You saved William's life. That counts for something. Not enough, Mills replied with grim certainty. Maybe not, Jackson agreed. But it's a start. Testify against Randall and the others. Help bring the full truth to light. It won't erase the past, but it might help shape a better future. As darkness fell completely, the pool began to glow with a subtle blue luminescence, the same color that had enveloped Harmon in his final moments, but gentler, almost beautiful. It cast the canyon in an ethereal light, transforming the harsh desert landscape into something otherworldly. The water remembers, Dakota said, appearing silently beside Jackson. It remembers every drop of blood, every tear, every act of courage or cowardice. It judges, but it also heals. Jackson thought of Harmon's fate, of his own long journey from Willow Creek to this moment of the Thornton children, who had lost so much yet somehow retained their humanity. Does it forgive? He asked quietly. Dakota's ancient eyes reflected the pool's blue glow. That depends on whether you can forgive yourself, Jackson Ward. In the distance, Calloway organized the prisoners for the journey back to civilization. Rebecca and Thomas sat with William by a small fire, the three siblings united in their grief, yet strengthened by their survival. Nihil conferred with his warriors, planning for the protection of Silent Waters in the days to come. A new chapter was beginning for all of them, written in water rather than blood. As Jackson gazed into the luminous depths of the pool, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, not the complete absolution he had once sought, but perhaps something more valuable, the chance to begin again, to build rather than destroy. The water judged, but it also renewed. A week after Harmon's demise, the Canyon of Silent Waters had transformed from battlefield to sanctuary. The bodies of the fallen had been laid to rest with appropriate ceremonies. Apache warriors returned to the earth with traditional songs and prayers, while the white casualties were buried with simple Christian rites performed by Marshal Calloway, who had once served as a field chaplain during the war. Jackson stood at the edge of the mysterious pool, watching its glassy surface reflect the morning sky. The water showed no sign of the violence it had unleashed upon Harmon, no hint of the judgment it had rendered. It was once again perfectly still and clear, revealing nothing of its true nature or power. Still trying to understand it, Rebecca asked, joining him by the water's edge. Jackson nodded. I've seen a lot in my life, but nothing like what happened to Harmon. Nahil says the water doesn't kill, it reveals, Rebecca replied. That what we saw was Harmon's true self exposed by the water's power. A comforting thought, Jackson mused, that the water merely reveals rather than condemns. Rebecca studied his profile. You're wondering what it would show if you entered it. It wasn't a question, and Jackson didn't treat it as one. After a moment's silence, he said, We all carry darkness within us, Rebecca. Mine has haunted me since Willow Creek. Yet you risked your life to save us, she pointed out. That counts for something. Before Jackson could respond, Thomas approached William, trailing behind him. The older boy's face was grim with determination. Calloway's back from Tucson, Thomas announced, with news about Randall. They gathered at the large central wickiup that had become their impromptu headquarters. Marshal Calloway sat with Nihil and Dakota, their unlikely alliance forged in the shared battle against Harmon. Mills was there too, his status somewhere between prisoner and reluctant ally. Randall's disappeared, Calloway announced without preamble. The federal marshals in San Francisco found his private rail car empty when the train arrived. He must have disembarked somewhere along the route. So he's escaped justice, Thomas said bitterly. For now, Calloway acknowledged. But Judge Clayton has issued federal warrants for his arrest. Every lawman from here to the Pacific is looking for him. He won't be found unless he wants to be, Mills commented. Randall has resources beyond what you imagine, contacts in Washington, Europe, even China. The water was just one venture among many for him. What about the evidence? Jackson asked. Morgan's journal, the survey maps. Judge Clayton has authenticated everything, Calloway confirmed. He's ordered an immediate review of all land grants in the territory. Governor Rawlins has already resigned, fled more accurately, probably to Mexico. And the water rights, Rebecca pressed. That's more complicated, Calloway admitted. Legally, this land falls within the boundaries of the original Apache reservation established by treaty in 1868, but that treaty was subsequently modified by executive order to open the area for settlement. White settlement, Nahil interjected coldly. Calloway nodded, acknowledging the point. Judge Clayton has issued a temporary injunction preventing any development or water diversion in this region, pending a full federal investigation. That buys us time, but not a permanent solution. There is a solution, Jackson said, an idea taking shape. The evidence we've gathered doesn't just implicate Harmon and Randall. It proves systematic fraud in the Territorial Land Office, fake surveys altered boundaries, forged signatures on deeds. So, Thomas asked, so every land grant derived from those fraudulent actions could be declared invalid, Jackson explained, including the executive order that reduced the Apache reservation. Calloway's eyes widened as he grasped the implications. You're suggesting we could legally restore the original reservation boundaries? Not just restore them, Jackson continued. Establish a new kind of arrangement, a shared trust perhaps. The Apache would retain sovereignty over their ancestral lands, including Silent Waters, but with guaranteed water access for the surrounding ranches. The railroad would fight it, Mills pointed out. They need water for their steam engines. Let them pay for it, Rebecca suggested. Fair compensation to the Apache for water usage, with limits to prevent overuse or contamination. Nahil had been listening intently, his expression unreadable. Now he spoke. You propose that Apache become business partners with the railroad. I propose that Apache become equal participants in shaping the territory's future, Jackson clarified, with legal title to your land and control over your resources. Dakota's ancient eyes gleamed with interest. The old ones spoke of a time when all peoples would share the water's blessing. Perhaps this is what they foresaw. Calloway stroked his mustache thoughtfully. It would take federal legislation, presidential approval. The political obstacles would be substantial. But not insurmountable, Jackson insisted. Not with the evidence we have. Governor Rawlins's corruption, Randall's conspiracy, the Territorial Land Office's systematic fraud, it's all documented in Morgan's journal. This could be a template for a new relationship between the government and Native peoples throughout the West. A heavy silence fell as each person considered the proposal from their own perspective. William, who had been quiet throughout the discussion, suddenly spoke up. Pa would have liked this idea, he said simply. He always said water belonged to everyone, not just whoever had the biggest gun. Rebecca squeezed her youngest brother's shoulder, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He did say that, didn't he? The mention of Mike Thornton seemed to shift something in the atmosphere. Nahil and Calloway exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between these two men from entirely different worlds. I will speak with the elders, Nahil finally decided. This is not a decision for me alone. And I'll wire Judge Clayton, Calloway added. See if he can arrange a meeting with a territorial representative in Washington. As the gathering dispersed, Jackson found himself standing once again by the edge of Silent Waters. The pool's surface had begun to display the subtle blue luminescence that appeared each evening at sunset, a gentle glow that seemed to rise from its depths. You've set something in motion that cannot be easily stopped, Dakota observed, joining him by the water. Like the underground rivers, it will find its own path. For better or worse, Jackson acknowledged, the water does not concern itself with better or worse, the old medicine man replied. Only with what is true, that is its power and its burden. He studied Jackson thoughtfully. You still fear its judgment. Jackson didn't deny it. Some sins leave permanent stains, Dakota. Perhaps, the old man conceded, but even the deepest stain can fade with time and proper care. He gestured toward the pool. The water awaits whenever you are ready to face it. Before Jackson could respond, a commotion erupted from the canyon entrance. A sentry was calling out, announcing the approach of riders. For a tense moment, everyone reached for weapons, the memory of Harmon's attack still fresh. But as the riders came into view, Nahil relaxed. Apache warriors, he announced, from the Shadow Mountain Band. The new arrivals, 6 in number, dismounted at the canyon entrance. Their leader, a tall warrior with distinctive facial scarring, approached Nahil with deliberate formality. They spoke rapidly in Apache, their conversation becoming increasingly animated. What's happening? Rebecca asked Jackson. I'm not sure, he replied, watching the exchange with growing concern. After several minutes, Nahil turned to address them, his expression grim. Randall has been found, he announced, with 20 hired guns and 5 wagons of equipment moving toward the proposed railroad crossing at Diablo Canyon. That's less than 30 miles from here. Calloway noted, his hand moving instinctively to his revolver. What's his plan? Jackson demanded. According to our scouts, he intends to dynamite the canyon walls to create a dam, Nahil explained. It would divert the underground water flow away from Silent Waters and toward a reservoir he's constructing near the railroad line. Cutting off the water at its source, Jackson realized. If he can't control Silent Waters directly, he'll redirect the water to where he can control it. Would that work? Thomas asked. Mills nodded grimly. With enough explosives and the right placement, yes. Randall studied engineering at Yale before the war. He knows exactly what he's doing. How soon? Calloway pressed. They begin tomorrow at dawn, Nahil replied. The charges are already being placed. Then we have no time to lose, Jackson declared. We have to stop him before he can detonate those explosives. And there are 20 of them and just us, Thomas pointed out. Even with Nahil's warriors were outnumbered. Not necessarily, the scarred warrior interjected in surprisingly good English. My band has 30 warriors ready to fight. Chief Nahil need only give the word. And so he shall, Nahil confirmed, reaching a decision. Randall threatens not just Silent Waters, but all waters that flow beneath our mountains. This cannot be permitted. Plans were quickly formulated. The Apache warriors would approach Diablo Canyon from the north and east, using their superior knowledge of the terrain to position themselves on the surrounding ridges. Jackson, Calloway, and Mills would lead a smaller force from the south, hoping to catch Randall between the two groups. What about us? Rebecca demanded when she realized the Thornton siblings were being excluded from the assault plan. You stay here with William, Jackson insisted. Someone needs to guard Silent Waters. I've earned the right to see this through, she argued fiercely. We all have. Thomas can come, Jackson conceded after a moment's consideration. You stay with William. Before Rebecca could protest further, Thomas placed a hand on her arm. He's right, Rebecca. William needs you. And if we fail, you'll be the last one who knows the full truth about what happened here. Reluctantly, she agreed, though the fire in her eyes made it clear she did so under protest. They departed at midnight, traveling under a 3/4 moon that cast enough light to navigate by while still providing shadows for concealment. The journey to Diablo Canyon would take most of the night, positioning them to strike just before Randall's planned detonation at dawn. As they rode, Jackson found himself beside Mills, the two former enemies united now in common purpose. Why are you helping us? Jackson asked bluntly. You could have fled after Harmon died. Kite Mills was silent for several moments before answering. I told myself for years that I was just following orders at Willow Creek, that the responsibility was Harmon's, not mine. He stared straight ahead, his profile harsh in the moonlight. But when I saw him holding that boy, ready to kill him, just like we killed those children in Tennessee, something broke inside me. I finally saw what I'd become. Redemption doesn't come easy, Jackson observed. I don't expect redemption, Mills replied. Just the chance to die doing something right for once. The grimness of this statement hung between them as they continued toward Diablo Canyon, each man lost in his own thoughts. They reached their destination an hour before dawn. Diablo Canyon was aptly named a jagged gash in the earth, with walls that resembled demonic faces in the eerie pre-dawn light. Far below, a small stream trickled through the canyon floor, belying the massive underground water flows that converged beneath it. From their vantage point, they could see Randall's camp established at the canyon's widest point. Wagons had been arranged in a defensive circle, and men moved purposefully in the light of several campfires. At the canyon's edge, a tripod had been erected, apparently for lowering men and equipment down the sheer walls. They're already placing charges, Mills whispered, pointing to tiny figures suspended along the canyon wall. We need to move now before they finish. Nahil signaled to his warriors positioned along the surrounding ridges. In response, they knocked arrows to bows and raised rifles, awaiting the command to fire. Remember, Jackson instructed the men with him. Randall is to be taken alive if possible. We need him to stand trial to expose everyone involved in this conspiracy. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Nahil gave the signal. Apache war cries shattered the morning stillness as arrows and bullets rained down on Randall's camp. The hired guns responded with remarkable discipline, taking cover behind wagons and returning fire in controlled volleys. Jackson led his group in a charge from the south, hoping to breach the wagon circle, while Randall's men were distracted by the Apache attack from the ridges. They had nearly reached the perimeter when a volley of gunfire drove them to cover behind a cluster of boulders. They were expecting us, Calloway shouted over the din of battle. Someone must have warned them. The council, Mills suggested grimly. They have eyes everywhere. Through a gap in the boulders, Jackson caught a glimpse of Edward Randall, a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair and patrician features, incongruously dressed in an immaculate three-piece suit despite the rugged surroundings. He was calmly directing his men's defense while consulting a pocket watch. He's timing something, Jackson realized aloud. The charges they must be set to detonate automatically. As if confirming his worst fears, Randall suddenly began ordering his men to withdraw from the wagon circle, falling back toward a narrow side canyon where horses were tethered. "They're leaving," Thomas shouted. "They're going to trigger the explosives and escape while we're busy with their rear guard." Jackson made a split-second decision. Thomas, stay with Calloway. Mills with me. Without waiting for acknowledgement, Jackson darted from cover, zigzagging through bullet-kicked dust toward the tripod at the canyon's edge. Mills followed close behind, providing covering fire with remarkable accuracy. They reached the tripod just as Randall was preparing to mount his horse. The railroad man turned, his cold eyes widening in surprise at their approach. "Ward, I presume," he said with unnerving calm. "Harmon described you rather accurately, the self-righteous sergeant with the unfortunate habit of interfering where you're not wanted." "It's over, Randall," Jackson replied, his rifle trained on the man's chest. "The charges, where's the detonator?" A thin smile crossed Randall's aristocratic features. "You're too late. In approximately 30 seconds, 500 pounds of dynamite will reshape the geology of this region quite dramatically." He glanced at his pocket watch again. "Make that 20 seconds now." Mills lunged forward, grabbing Randall by his expensive lapels. "Where's the detonator?" he demanded, pressing his revolver to the man's temple. "There isn't one," Randall replied, still eerily calm. "Time-delayed fuses, Mr. Mills. A precaution against precisely this sort of interference." "How do we stop it?" Jackson demanded. "You don't," Randall said simply. "Now I suggest we all vacate the area with haste unless you prefer to be buried under several tons of rock." A shout from the canyon rim drew their attention. Nahil was pointing urgently to the canyon wall where the charges had been placed. To Jackson's astonishment, several Apache warriors were scaling down the sheer face with remarkable agility, racing against time to reach the dynamite. "Futile," Randall commented. "The fuses are already burning. Even if they reach the charges, they can't possibly—" His words were cut short as Mills struck him viciously with the butt of his revolver, dropping him unconscious to the dust. "I've wanted to do that for months," the former lieutenant muttered. Jackson's attention remained fixed on the desperate scene unfolding on the canyon wall. The Apache warriors had reached the charges and were working frantically to extract them from their carefully placed positions. Among them, he recognized the scarred warrior who had brought news of Randall's plan. "They'll never make it in time," Mills observed grimly. "They know that," Jackson replied, understanding dawning. "They're trying to throw the charges into the canyon before they explode, minimize the damage to the walls." Even as he spoke, the first warrior successfully dislodged a bundle of dynamite and hurled it toward the canyon floor. Others followed suit, working with desperate speed. "Get down!" Jackson shouted, diving for cover and pulling Mills with him. The world erupted in thunder and flame. Multiple explosions shook the canyon, sending rock fragments flying in all directions. Dust billowed upward, temporarily blotting out the rising sun. When it finally cleared, Jackson raised his head cautiously to survey the damage. The canyon walls remained largely intact. The warriors had succeeded in preventing the catastrophic collapse Randall had planned. But the cost had been terrible. No sign remained of the brave men who had scaled the cliff face. "They sacrificed themselves," Mills murmured in awe, "to save the water." A cry of grief rose from the Apache warriors on the ridges, a haunting sound that echoed through the canyon like the wail of the wind itself. Nahil stood motionless, his face lifted to the sky in silent communion with the fallen. As the dust settled completely, the battle's outcome became clear. Randall's hired guns, seeing their employer captured and their escape route cut off, surrendered to Marshal Calloway's authority. The conspiracy that had threatened the territory's water and the Apache's existence had been broken, though at terrible cost. Jackson approached Nahil, who still stood rigid with grief. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Their sacrifice saved Silent Waters." "Among them was 2 rivers." Nahil revealed, his voice rough with emotion. "He did not die at Harmon's compound as we believed. Though wounded, he followed us, watching over us from shadows." 2 rivers, Jackson repeated in disbelief. "But I saw him fall." My brother was not easy to kill, Nihil replied with the ghost of a smile. He returned to us seeking forgiveness for his years among the whites. Today he found it. Jackson bowed his head, honoring Two Rivers' final sacrifice. He died as he lived between two worlds trying to build a bridge. Not trying, Nihil corrected. Succeeding. The journey back to Silent Waters was solemn, their victory tempered by the loss of the brave warriors who had prevented Randall's plan. Edward Randall himself, now conscious but securely bound, rode in sullen silence, his aristocratic demeanor cracked by the reality of his defeat. Rebecca and William were waiting anxiously at the canyon entrance, their faces lighting with relief as the returning party came into view. William ran to Thomas, throwing his arms around his brother's waist, while Rebecca embraced Jackson impulsively. "You're alive," she breathed, then pulled back embarrassed by her display of emotion. "All of you." "Not all, Thomas said quietly, explaining the sacrifice of Two Rivers and the other warriors. That evening, as the Apache held memorial ceremonies for their fallen Judge Clayton himself, arrived at Silent Waters accompanied by a detachment of U.S. Army cavalry. The judge, a tall, austere man with a reputation for incorruptible integrity, had traveled from Tucson as soon as he received word of Randall's capture. "Extraordinary," he commented, gazing at the luminous waters of the pool. "Simply extraordinary. And you say this water has unique properties. Properties that should be protected, not exploited," Jackson emphasized. "Indeed," Clayton agreed. "I've reviewed all the evidence, Morgan's journal, the survey maps, the testimonies. There's more than enough to convict Randall and his conspirators." He turned to Nihil. "And to restore the original boundaries of the Apache reservation with Silent Waters at its heart." "And the water rights for surrounding ranches?" Rebecca asked. "I'm proposing a novel legal arrangement," Clayton explained. "A shared trust, as Mr. Ward suggested. The Apache will maintain sovereignty over their land, including Silent Waters itself. The surrounding ranchers will have guaranteed water access rights in exchange for respecting usage limits and conservation practices." "And the railroad?" Calloway asked. "The Southern Pacific will pay an annual fee for water access," Clayton replied. "The fees will be divided between the Apache tribe and a territorial water conservation fund." "Randall's council won't accept this quietly," Mills warned. "They have influence in Washington in the financial centers back east." "Perhaps," Clayton acknowledged, "but they miscalculated in one crucial aspect. President Arthur has taken a personal interest in this case. The corruption revealed in Morgan's journal extends to several of his political opponents. He's quite motivated to see justice done." As plans were finalized in the following days, a sense of tentative optimism took root. Randall was transported to Tucson under heavy guard, along with Mills, who had agreed to testify against his former employers, in exchange for consideration in his own sentencing. The Thornton siblings began rebuilding their ranch with help from neighboring ranchers who had been inspired by their stand against Harmon and Randall. What had begun as a desperate fight for survival had transformed into a community united in common purpose. On the final evening before departing Silent Waters, Jackson stood alone by the pool, watching its mysterious blue glow intensify with the setting sun. After a week of contemplation, he had made his decision. Removing his boots and shirt, he waded into the water. Its warmth surprised him, more like blood than water in its temperature. As he moved deeper until the water reached his chest, he felt a strange sensation, not unpleasant but profoundly unsettling, as if the water were somehow flowing through him rather than merely around him. Images flashed before his mind's eye. Willow Creek in flames, Elizabeth's face as he left for war, the terror in William's eyes as Harmon held him hostage, Two Rivers plunging to his death to save the waters. Each memory brought pain, but also clarity. His failures and his efforts, his courage and his cowardice, all laid bare by the water's judgment. When he finally emerged, Rebecca was waiting on the shore with a blanket. "What did you see?" she asked softly. "Everything," Jackson replied simply, "the good and the bad, what I was and what I might become." And a faint smile touched his lips. "The water doesn't wash away the past, Rebecca, but it does show the path forward." 1 year later, a small gathering assembled on the porch of the rebuilt Thornton Ranch House. Judge Clayton, resplendent in his formal judicial robes, stood before Jackson, Rebecca, Thomas, and William. Nahil and several Apache elders watched from a respectful distance, honored guests at this momentous occasion. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona and the United States of America. Clayton pronounced solemnly, I hereby declare Jackson Ward the legal guardian of Thomas, Rebecca, and William Thornton, with all rights and responsibilities thereto. The simple ceremony complete, Clayton handed Jackson the official documents. Congratulations, he said with a rare smile. You've become a family in truth as well as in deed. As celebration commenced, Nahil approached Jackson, extending his hand in the white man's gesture of respect. The water chose well, he said cryptically. I'm still learning to listen to it, Jackson admitted. As are we all, Nahil replied. The Great Council meets next month in Tucson to discuss the Shared Water Trust. As representative of the Apache Nations, I would welcome your presence. I'd be honored, Jackson said sincerely. As the sun set over the desert, painting the landscape in gold and crimson, Jackson stood with his new family watching the distant mountains where silent waters lay hidden. The burdens of the past had not vanished, but they had transformed into something he could carry with greater ease, a reminder rather than a condemnation. In the desert, he told the Thornton siblings, the one who holds the water holds life itself. But only when water is shared fairly does life truly flourish. The last light caught Rebecca's profile as she gazed toward the mountains, her expression one of quiet determination. Thomas stood tall beside her, his arm around William's shoulders, the three of them united by blood and hardship, strengthened by survival. They were, Jackson realized, the true legacy of Silent Waters. Not the mineral wealth Randall had coveted, nor the power Harmon had craved, but the resilience of the human spirit and the bonds forged in adversity. The water had judged, the water had renewed, and now the water would sustain them all, flowing unseen beneath the desert, connecting past to future, sustaining life in an unforgiving land.